Good morning.
Can everyone take their seats, please? Okay. My name is Lydia McCamish. I am one of the program managers with the CAE Program Management Office. And I'm happy to be here. I'm sure you are, because you learned a lot those last couple days. So I just want to start by saying, if you guys have any questions or any lingering thoughts from the last 2 days, this is your chance to please share it, because we have a short day and it's going to go by very fast. So if there's anyone have anything? Okay. Sarah?
Question with regard
Hold on 1 second, please.
I can talk with my professorial voice. Thank you. Yeah, just in light of some of the, I'll say, concerns and also challenges that we talked about with regard to visibility of the program and talking about IC, CAE, and so on. Not so much the individual students. I understand we won't be publishing names and we won't do pictures. I was just curious around the other campuses, do you still use the IC, CAE and all that on like names of labs and things like that, or have you tried to actually pull back on that much visibility? And you know, we could call something, I know some of you have different names and saying, hey, we have an IC, CAE in X. So I don't know if my question's ringing, but the point is we've got one in critical technologies. We could very easily name our labs and do our newspaper things about, you know, a Center of Academic Excellence in critical technologies and not mention the IC, but we also want the IC to have credit. So just wondered if anybody has any.
I think there is mixed answers about that, but anyone is interested to respond to our question?
All right. Hector, you want to? I'm putting Hector on. Well, Hector has the program, so.
Good morning. Just from my view, as NSA, no matter what you call your programs locally, that's all well and good. But for us, and to help us out, when you do your resume, make sure your students put the full name, you know, Intelligence Community Centers for Academic Excellence, as well as the acronym, because that's just going to help our search systems do that. So, you know I see a lot of them with the local school name for the program, and that's all well and good, but make sure they put the ICCAE on there.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes, I echo what Curtis just said. For instance, we instruct our fellows, for instance, to in their resumes and their personal statements to not just mention FIU. They're always identified as ICCAE Intelligence Fellows at Florida International University. Our critical technologies lab is as an ICCAE lab. We brand it that way. We're very conscious of operational security, like we said, like yesterday. We try not to, or we don't market our students in photographs, or our home school is always asking us to do features on our students. And we're very hesitant at times, and again, we participate when we've had some major successes, receiving the grants and what have you. But we're very cautious again on not placing student names. We do call ourselves in the ICCAE Center at FIU. In fact, so the Gordon Institute manages other programs, and the one we try to have front and center is the ICCAE program. But we're just always cognizant on letting students know that to the community, you need to market yourself as such. At FIU, they're ambassadors for the ICCAE Intelligence Fellowship Program.
Just real quick. Technically, according to the grant guidelines, I don't know about the critical technologies grant, but the prior cycle, we were required to brand our centers as ICCAE on our websites. And the current FOA also requires us to have a website dedicated to the ICCAE. So I just want to bring that up as we sort of think about security issues in the future.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh.
That was the point I was going to make, because I think there's a requirement that many of us do. So at the University of Mississippi, we do it. We're proud of the designation. It has not been problematic for us. Without getting into any of the good points that were made yesterday afternoon on this discussion, I just say, there's a limit to how much you should obscure your activities, because as someone said, you will stifle the program. And I'll just tell you one story, and I suspect some of you guys have had this happen to you, but Last semester I had a student come into my office, sort of closes the door, starts speaking in a hushed tone, and asks me if it's possible for him to get the registrar to sort of expunge all records of him taking Intel courses on his transcript, which I looked and I said, this is the silliest thing I've ever heard. What benefit will possibly come to you from doing that if you can't market the fact that you took these courses and participated in this program? So I'm all for being wise about how we market our students, but there's a limit to that, I think.
Thank you.
So at Rutgers University, we're not just concerned with the security of our students. Of course we are. We're also concerned with being transparent to the community and the public. So we do have a robust ICCAE website. And when we have our newsletters, we promote the ICCAE, we have that seal on. When we have emails, we do that as well. And obviously, it's been mentioned previously that we make sure we don't advertise our students, we don't have pictures up, but when we have community members ask us, what is this program? It doesn't look like we're hiding anything. It doesn't look like we don't want the community to know that there is this program going on. So having that walking that fine line, being sure that the public can access this, but not the students, is our primary concern. And I think we've done that pretty well.
Thank you. So before introducing our first speakers, Ms. Noini would like to say something.
Thank you, Lydia.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We are at our last day, and I'm sort of saddened. I enjoy, because you are like my extended family, and I enjoy having time with you and hear your successes and your concerns and your recommendations. And I will say this to you, you have been hearing about the transition, and I'm not a U.S. Army veteran. What? Hoorah. Mother of a Marine? Okay. Nobody, come on, I know there are Army veterans in here.
Army.
Marines? Air Force. Okay. Ms. McKay? Okay, gotcha. And so what I can tell you is that in the Army there are 3 general rules, right? Don't ask me about 2 or 3. I don't even remember. But I remember this one. Number 1, it says, I will guard everything within the limits of my post and quit my post only when properly relieved. Why do I say that? Because you have heard about this transition. And that doesn't mean that I am going away or my team is going away. We will eventually ride into the sunset, okay? But this program will remain under my jurisdiction until it no longer does, right? And that is, so right now the date that we're looking at is 1 October. But you know the federal government, we may have a CR. And if the CR happens, guess what? Still my baby, until it's no longer my baby, okay? So put that to the side, continue to do the best that you can do for the program, continue to interface with each other, share information. That is the purpose of the Professional Development Summit, that you share information, that you support each other. This is not an FIU, this is not, you know, an Ole Miss or any, you know, specific school. This is an us, right? And like I said, we rise together, we fall together. This program is a teenager. It has been around for 15 years. And in my mind, I'm like, what the heck are we talking about? This security concerns now. The kid is 15 years old. We should have addressed that when he was a little baby, right? But here we are, right? And so we will assure you, at least I will assure you, that these issues we will discuss, right? And we will put guidance that is going to help us to guide you better, right? To protect the program, to protect our students. Because you guys are doing the most absolutely wonderful job, because you're creating the next generation of diverse intelligence officer. the next director of one of our organizations may be sitting here right now. And you help create that. So don't take your responsibilities lightly. And that goes for the PIs. For the IC organizations in the room, make it your business to support this program. So when we call you and we say, hey, we want to come and do a roadshow, don't give me 4 people. Make that auditory in your organization be full of individuals who are selecting officials who can make an impact on the hiring decisions for the ICCA students. Agreed? See? Yes? Right? So, I will have to leave. I am the mother of a Marine who's getting promoted tomorrow to E8. Thank you. And so I will be arriving to DC hopefully before the snows start, and departing first thing in the morning because I have to drive about 2.5 hours to where he is. So I want to thank you. But before I say anything else, I want to thank my wonderful team. So without you, I couldn't do this. Your daily support, in spite of my strong earth, this is for people who know about tetramath, right? I'm the earth, and you are my air and my fire, right? And my water and halfway earth, and you know, but when I'm looking for groundness, right? They say, okay, we're gonna ground you, because they know if they don't, I'm gonna come after them. I'm gonna come after their air and their fire, you know, and their water and everything else. But this program has been successful for the past 2 years, thanks to the team that I have. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I couldn't do it without you, and I sincerely mean that. So I wish I could have $1 million for each of you, but I don't. I can always put a little bucket out there and see if this guy's going to help me with that. But you know that I love you and sincerely care for you. So thank you so very much. Dr. Valero, sir, Carmen, the team of in UTEP, thank you so much. It is a wonderful moment for me to come back here and interface with each and every one of you, the support that you have provided us, the work, the guidance that you have given us, the speakers that you provided, the facilities, the food was good. I love the mariachis, right? That deserves an applause. Because it gave us an opportunity to interface with each other, to engage. How many of you made new networking connections? I hope all of you, okay? The wine was delicious, the Dos Equis was delicious, okay? So everything that thus far we've had received from our host has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so very much for the hospitality you have offered us. Carmen, thank you for working so hard and so, you know, diligently for us. Carmen is not here, but you and Carmen are my sheroes. You know, these women can move faster on high heels than I can on tennis shoes, you know. So again, thank you so very much. To my partners in ODNI, Linda, I miss you, girl. She was my navigator and I had to fire her yesterday. Kara, Reem, thank you so very much for supporting the program. And collectively, we hope to make it better, okay? So the last thing that I have is we are looking for a location for next year's Professional Development Summit. If you're interested, please send me an email. Let one of these guys know. Let Linda know. So that when, huh?
Key West.
Key West, no, we don't have it. I don't think that FIU extends that far south, right?
We do have our green flag.
Well, Key West sounded good. So if your university is interested, please let one of my team members know, or Linda. so that when I get back to the office on Monday, we can start working on this. Normally we start working about a year out. Takes a lot of time, right? And we want to be mindful of your time as well. So please let us know. So with that, I close my session. I thank you. I wish you traveling mercies. And until the next time, I love you very much.
And before Noemi actually leaves and gets out of here and starts to fly the friendly skies, we actually would like to, on behalf of the Program Management Office team, the UTEP team, all of the principal investigators, the coordinators, say thank you, Noemi. One of the things that she really instills in us as program managers, can't see them, but I have goosebumps right now. She always tells us that we have...
Cry, I have expensive makeup on.
That it shouldn't run. She always tells us that we have to have the fire in the belly in order for us to do what we do. And whenever we come out to visit your schools, that's what we try to exude when we come to visit you. And when we're asking questions about how you're giving access and awareness to your college students, it's because of the fire that she ignites in our bellies. And she allows us the fortitude to just go out and do the things that we do well, and she just lets us go out and do it. So she has a lot of things going on in her personal life right now and throughout the year, but she always makes time to come and visit your schools, to come to this professional development summit, and we take note of all of that and we glean from all of your leadership. So on behalf of all of us, we would like to present you with this token of appreciation to say thank you. She always tells us two things: to start on time and stop on time. So we have this nice UTEP clock that she can put on her desk.
Oh, no.
And the nice UTEP miners pen, because she's always talking about mining the talent at your different universities. She's going out to the entire IC saying, hey, we're developing this talent. You've got to go and mine this talent. So we couldn't think of something more symbolic to give her. So on behalf of everybody here, we just like to say thank you. We appreciate you. We value you. We love you. Congratulations with your son. Godspeed, traveling mercies, and we'll see you back in DC.
Thank you so very much.
And with that, we'll introduce our first speakers for the day, Mr. Eric Jens and Mr. Bruce McKay from NIU.
You're on it, okay. Sure. I see everyone is way back from the front row. I will thwart your intentions by moving amongst you while I speak. And there's no Bruce. Clicker here. Works. Yes, it does. Okay. So I'm Eric. That's Bruce. And we'll be interrupting each other on a regular basis. And if anybody smells the burning rubber of error in anything that we say, please speak up. We have questions, concerns, inputs. We'd love to hear from you during as well as after our talk. I know we're running a bit late. I will stop talking for a bit in half an hour, so we have time to take a re-breakfast. We can re-breakfast ourselves, second breakfast, and then we'll continue until 10. Laura, keep me honest if I'm still talking at 9 o'clock. Make me stop, and we'll just adjust as needed. Does this work? There you go. Briefly, my background is an enlisted Army SIGINT specialist. Yes, I'm a sergeant. I once worked for a living. And then I was commissioned through ROTC. Accidentally went to law school, and when my school found out, they made me put together the National Security Law course. I've been teaching that for a number of years. Also counterterrorism, terrorism analysis, and other things. I've always been interested in intel ethics, and in fact, it's a good time to do a pitch for NIU. I don't know how much you've heard about us in the past couple of days. You know we exist, I assume. And back around 2012, we at NIU ran a couple of sections of our intelligence ethics course and had our students draft a bunch of possible ethical codes for the IC. Was the IC a profession? And as such, was it on par with medicine, theology, law, and should have its own ethical code particular to the IC? And there were good arguments for and against that, but the students brainstormed, we put together what we thought were the strongest types of codes, and that ultimately was distilled into what you see here, the OD&I ethical principles. So we were in at the beginning of that, and I hope it's had a positive effect on the IC. Some ethical codes are very aspirational. They're very general about being excellent and always ascending upward. And others are very nuts and bolts, where you sign a briefing once a year to be ethical and not cheat on your tax returns or your travel expenses. We try to aim for a middle ground of reminding ourselves, the bullet points, what's important, and then why those things are important. And we hope to convince you, if you weren't already, of why ethics has a real, practical, operational role to play in all spheres of intelligence. Who's ever taken a poli-sci course or an IR course and heard of Thucydides and Emilian dialogue? Okay, those who haven't, you may have heard this. The lesson of realism from the Peloponnesian Wars thousands of years ago is, in this world, the strong take what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's the takeaway, and that's sort of the last argument of realists is, we saw it right here. The Athenians just killed everybody on Milos, despite all the arguments about, don't kill us because the gods won't like it. It's not nice. Somebody might do it to you sometime. And to every argument, the Athenian admirals would say, well, talk all you want, but in the end, you belong to us, and either pay tribute or be enslaved or killed, which is ultimately what happened to Milos. This is a mystery. What's less often discussed is about 300 pages later in Thucydides, the Athenians embark on one campaign too many and are beaten badly, I think, by the Spartans. And the few survivors of the battle are thrown into pits to starve and die over the next winter and summer. Somebody must have gotten away to tell this whole story. But to me, that lesson is, that's the world the Athenians made. They created a known world where you just kill everybody as brutally as you can to show who's boss. Now, is that realism? Maybe. Maybe it's constructivism too. Maybe that's, had they played a little more humanely at the beginning, maybe they wouldn't have suffered quite so much when it was their turn at the bottom of the turning wheel. That's just my pitch for showing that, the ethical choices they made at the beginning of this campaign, I would say, maybe affected how they came out at the end of it. So a few basic theories. This is not going to be a theory of ethics talk, but just to lay some groundwork of the most common ways to look at ethics and how they affect the job you do, whether it's medicine or intelligence or anything else. The Kantian deontological approach, where a sin is a sin, a wrong is a wrong, and no amount of rationalizing or pointing towards greater goods can make it so. Tell no lie, though the world should perish, for the ultimate Kantian parable. And his famous example was, the murderer comes to your door seeking the person in your basement. Can you lie to protect a life? Well, morally, ethically, no. You don't tell a lie. Now, would Kant himself have given up the innocent person in the basement? Probably not. But the thought experiment's point is that, in his view, a wrong is a wrong, and you don't get to whitewash it by saying, oh, but it was for a good reason. Maybe you'll still commit the wrong, but be aware that you're making a less bad choice, not a choice that's somehow justified by later good. And you can apply that, obviously, to any number of military decisions and intelligence decisions throughout history. On the other hand, you have the utilitarian approach, and the proponents of, say, enhanced interrogation, of which I am not one, would point to this saying, well, it's ugly business, but this is an ugly secret business, and by God, if you're going to save lives, you got to break some eggs, and if the egg happens to be the human rights of a person in custody, well, it's a bummer, but we're saving lives here. I won't get into that. That's a whole other quarter-long course in ethics I won't get into here. Then a social contract. Those of you who are or will be in the IC are implicit participants in a contract with the citizens of this great country. That, in a sense, we are licensed to keep secrets from those who pay our salaries and our operating funds. And they, an educated American understands secrets have to be kept. And we have to use that license discreetly, wisely. Right? Beware of mission creep. Beware of the urge to keep secrets for secret's sake, or to prevent embarrassment to yourself in the name of, and then claim national security as grounds and so on. And that also plays at the smaller scale into the relationship between a clandestine officer and his or her asset. What is the moral and ethical duty owed to that asset? We'll talk a bit more about that later. An arete or virtue ethics. Right? How do you inculcate a person or a community with an ethical code and way of being so automatically that it becomes instinctive, like Spartan warriors? A Spartan warrior didn't presumably have to think about, how do I be brave? You are brave. In that society, if you weren't brave, you probably didn't survive to adulthood anyway. But the idea is you became a person who would just do the right thing as defined by that community. Unless you think that's just an old story, how do we design basic training? That's a constantly moving target, to train soldiers, warriors, to be as hard as they need to be in combat, and yet not to lose a sense of humanity. And that's something we always grapple with. To train someone to be an effective Marine or warfighter of any kind, and then come home and be able to reintegrate and segue into a different existence. And we'll talk a bit more later on about sort of the case studies of intelligence analysis and collection, and how those are affected. Looking at, in a sense, most of Intel is divided into two tribes, the collectors and the analysts. You can slice that a few different ways. There's also a huge support network of the cover offices, the administrative people, the supply, all the things that make it possible for that agent to go into another country and do the things he or she does, or to run assets and so on. But in general, Intel analysis, any of you who have had any Intel history or even just history, know about things like curveball or intelligence analysis leading up to or during wars. And in the aftermath, looking at those decisions, to what extent were they objective intelligence based on the best collection available, and to what extent was it either perceived or actually driven by what the bosses, what the policymakers, system makers really wanted to hear. And so, without getting, again, a quarter-long course on intelligence leading up to X war, you can certainly fill that up. Fear of letting customers' displeasure affect particular analysis. How often can an analyst tell their boss with 100% certainty the enemy's going to attack here at this time? Never. Almost never. And yet, if you've got a boss who wants results and you're the S2, the Intel person, he or she is also dealing with ops, logistics, everything else, all at the op tempo of the war is on, or the campaign's on, or the Russians are moving here, China's moving there. If you constantly come into the room and say, well, sir, man, it's tricky, 60% they might do this, but you never know, it's a complicated business, human nature. Are you going to keep getting invited back to the big room? Maybe not. So there's a certain ethical pressure, perhaps, to project more confidence and competence than you might actually feel you possess. Because on the one hand, you want to be part of the process as a professional and a person, you want to be in the inner circle. On the other hand, the nature of Intel is somewhere between rare certainty or tea leaf reading, or something in the middle, based on your education, your experience. And so that tension is something that just exists at every level of tactical, operational analysis. Any analysts in the room, past or present, who have a perspective on that? Yes, sir.
So, I think it's important, so with terminology. So I've done tours in the Marine Corps, doing railroad operations. I've done a couple different tours in the Marine Corps, my last being with the Joint Interagency Task Force South, doing counter-narcotics analysis on a watch floor. And I think we create terminology, right? We can't always say with absolute unless we have absolute. And oftentimes in our business we don't have that. And I would use an example of whether or not a maritime vessel, which we were tracking or attempting to interdict, was either loaded with narcotics or not. And sometimes when we were advising the ops officer on watch on whether or not they need to move assets around for interdiction or whether or not they should hold off, it was always sometimes based upon what we know about it, based upon what we see, based upon what we don't know, the most likely course of action is this has happened, or something of that nature. Very rarely did I ever approach it as a, this is an absolute. I did make a bet at one point in time with another watch officer for a year's salary, whether or not a boat was loaded. We had difference of opinions. I actually won that one, but I didn't get their salary, by the way. But it's difficult because sometimes you have limited resources and you have to try to advise to the best of your ability based on what you know to be true or what information has led you to believe. And sometimes you're putting your reputation on the line when you're providing those analyses.
So of course, if you have a promotion, your reputation, your mortgage might be at stake. For not just for being an accurate prognosticator, but making your boss happy. Constant moving target. Groupthink. Groupthink is often used as shorthand for any decision made by other people that you don't like. And in fact, there's more to it than that. Groupthink tends to involve, obviously, probably some kind of charismatic central figure who is not ordering people to be yes men, but that's the perception. You want to be in the inner circle, and so you say and do what you think they want. And when they ruminate, who will rid me of this troublesome priest or analyst, suddenly that person's future doesn't look so good. Not that any orders were given, but you want to please the boss. It's human nature. In actual groupthink, as Irving Janis defined it back in the 80s, there's generally a person in the group, not the boss, who appoints themselves as sort of a minder. The Russians had a formal position, the Zampoly, the political officer. And in a group of people, there's generally somebody, think of Dwight from The Office, who will sort of appoint themselves as the enforcer, and will stop sending out the invites to those whose opinion doesn't seem to be really on board with the clique. And something to guard against. President Kennedy fell victim to this, arguably during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have all these type A with rabies dudes, warfighters, who want to stick it to the commies, and nobody in the room who could push back, except I think Secretary of State, and he stopped getting invites. 2 years later, President Kennedy had learned, and during the Missile Crisis, he had created a situation where there was principled dissent and argument in the room. And the reason we're all sitting here today alive and well is probably largely due to the lessons he learned from his experience with groupthink, and then taking measures to counter it. And then all the other ethical hesitations, if you work in a cube farm, cutting corners, all those things, that's not particular to Intel. And then on the other side, the collection side, some overlap, but there's always pressure to get the job done. And one temptation is afraid to fall in love with the source or an asset. And it's not usually a romantic issue, it's just that you spend a year or two working with an asset and there's a bond there. There might be dangerous conditions, and I'm talking here about clandestine traditional operations, not overt debriefings where everyone is on board and there's no real danger involved. And so you work with this person for a long time, and you want to get them recruited as an official asset. And that's a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucratic, legal, counterintelligence, financial hurdles to get through to actually be able to recruit somebody to commit treason on behalf of the US government. And if you're a professional officer, in the CIA at least, your metric as a case officer is how many scalps do you have? Who did you get the sign on the line that is dotted? I spot that reference. And we actually had, I'll be vague in details here, we had a student a few years ago who wanted to write a thesis on agency performance metrics. And his argument was that there should be less emphasis on how many recruitments and more emphasis on how much foreign intelligence, which after all is a primary mission. And he got a certain distance into an excellent argument, and then word came down from way on high atop the thing to ixnay that topic. And, yes, Bruce?
That was my thesis student. And he pushed this through, he was a CIA officer. He pushed that up to the Deputy Director for Operations, who told him in so many words,
"This is a wonderful topic. Write on this and find a new job."
And on one hand, it's easy to write that off as evil, stupid bosses who don't get it. But on the other hand, the agency is about source system. There's a certain culture of going out in dangerous situations, relying on yourself, getting other human beings, to become recruitment assets. And that is a culture that has worked for a long time. And maybe it's lesser of the evils, from the ethical point of view. Maybe it's less bad to just have this focus on how many recruitments do you have, not if you have 12 different developmental assets who might or might not be sources. In the meantime, there's good intel, but maybe you get further ultimately by maintaining this emphasis on get people recruited. Don't have a bunch of folks who might or might not want to work with us. We want recruited assets. I'm not an expert on which one would be ultimately more useful, but there are certainly ethical pressures if you've got somebody who might or might not be an asset, maybe to oversell them just a little bit. Maybe you sincerely believe it. The collector doesn't have access to what the all-source analyst knows about this source. Maybe the source has been just translating local newspapers once a week for the investigations officer, and the analyst spots that, the collector doesn't. But there can be ethical pressure, again, if not to fall in love with the source, to at least pitch them aggressively beyond what the analysis might support. Moral commitments to an asset. If I'm running an asset in some other country and they get killed, do I have any legal duty at all to do anything for their family? Anything enforceable? No. Thank you for 15 minutes. Are there practical reasons to follow through with any verbal, non-enforceable commitments I made? Do you think word gets around about how America treats the people who work for it? If I promise my asset, that's Kabul or wherever, that I will take care of their family if they're killed in a course relationship, and then they just say, screw, it's not enforceable, who cares? You think that brothers and uncles don't figure out what happened and it's passed word around, and suddenly it's hard for the Americans to get people to work for them anymore? There was a case a few years ago, Kenneth v. Doe, legal case, folks in the agency might recognize it. Two Soviet defectors at great risk for themselves and remained in place during the Cold War collecting for the agency, and they were resettled under alias in the US. They did the right thing, arguably, and turned down the pension, the lifelong money they had been promised to the agency, because they had gotten paying work on the West Coast, and they wanted to make it by themselves. Because of the conditions of their cover, they were limited from what kind of employment they could take. So when the husband was laid off, and because his cover was relatively thin, he couldn't really work in a profession or anything else, they went back to the agency and said, please turn the tap back on. The agency said no. So they ultimately sued, not to make the agency cough up, but simply to figure out what administrative processes the agency had gone through. And the agency lawyers cited a Civil War era precedent saying the government can cite state secrets. You cannot sue on the basis of a spy contract. That is settled, absolutely rock solid American law. You cannot sue in US civil court on an espionage contract because the nature of the contract is contrary to policy and security to allow that to be litigated. And that's a whole other story. So the legal answer was solid. The tenants were told, it went to the Supreme Court, and finally the Supreme Court cited law and said they get nothing. Now legally, that was a pretty strong case. Was that the best ethical case? Bruce, you have a little insight into this. You knew some of the folks involved. What was the... Well, actually, let me ask you, sir. Operationally, was that the best choice to make, you think?
Probably not operational. Most likely not operationally because of second and third order impacts down the road.
Mm-hmm. It's got a decision made on strictly legal grounds that ethically didn't look too good for us. And and once the Supreme Court, it was as overt and open as it could be. Word gets around. This is how America treats the people who risk their lives for America. They cite a bunch of lawyers. And there's another greater lesson there, that if you have a good lawyer in your agency, will hopefully give you the bloodless legal answer, and then maybe the consigliere answer of this, lawful but awful. Legally, this is the option. I'm telling you, it's not going to look good if you go strictly on the law. Maybe go another way, because practically and operationally, to do better if the word gets out that we look after our people. And then one issue that may be more germane to collectors and analysts is there are deployed analysts, but collectors are more likely perhaps to be operating alone or on small bases or far forward of administrative hubs. And so there's general relaxation of standards that happens. Right? Shoes don't get shine, nobody irons uniforms, the shaving, who needs it, right? But that attitude can also infect the paperwork and the administrative and the operational, even the tradecraft, if you have a few people with no effective supervision. My own dissertation research is on intelligence oversight, focusing on interrogation. And these things come up again and again when things go wrong. It's almost, I won't say always, very often because nobody's watching the Guardians. You see it in the Stanford Prison Experiment, of course, and other areas that when no one's watching, people in a closed environment talk themselves into all kinds of horrible things that they're just unaware of until somebody from the outside comes in to exert oversight or be astounded and go to the press or whatever. So it's any of you working in the IC eventually will end up in a situation where the boss is 1,000 miles away or 6 time zones away, and probably will never find out what you're doing. So what makes you do the right thing? James Mattis famously had a motto, always have a plan to kill everybody you meet. Well, that's not so different from the Boy Scout motto, be prepared, the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, I think? Semper, yeah. He's not saying literally he's going to cut your throat if you go to a meeting with Jim Mattis. He's saying that be prepared for all contingencies, and that applies to ethics. Most ethical disasters, and Bruce will have more to say about this based on some IG reports, don't come from people setting out to be evil, but because they just weren't prepared or hadn't thought in advance, what will they do if X happens? And suddenly X happens and they kind of react reflexively, and years later, it turns out that was not a morally or ethically defensible act to take, but they hadn't thought about what might happen. When the asset suddenly comes to them and says, don't go on this op because you're going to kill my cousin who's an informant. So now you have an operational need to like drop a missile on some bad guys, and maybe a moral imperative to take care of this asset's family. So you have, what do you do? And if you haven't thought about that in advance, it's easy to make a snap ethical decision that maybe doesn't hold up later on, that you yourself might regret forever. I'm a big fan of St. Augustine, and I couldn't help repurposing his famous quote, "Oh Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet, Lord, not yet." So there's always temptation, to say, I believe in ethics and intelligence, but this is really important op, and just once will bend the rules. It's never just once. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these you'll have heard of as the reason that we have the IRB, right? Good luck trying to plan this today. I want to torment 20 college undergraduates at a fake prison and see what happens. Probably going to need some extra paperwork in that one nowadays. But I do want to say about this, and this does relate to the Intel community. There's been a lot of second guessing of Milgram over the years. This is a famous shock experiment. Most of you have heard of this, I think. And it's been taken apart since then. His methodology might have been, the suspect. But in general, there was most compliance with a subject torturing or zapping this, the actor playing a subject when the people giving the orders were not giving orders as themselves, but just saying the experiment requires it. I, in my faceless, my white lab coat, saying the experiment requires you to continue. That tends to enforce more compliance than saying, I'm Dr. Jens, I'm telling you, you better do this, or you're not going to get your $50 for the experiment. And something that's there about people faced with impersonal authority, i.e. the IC, the SES, who's giving the orders. It's very difficult psychologically to push back when there's a very diffuse authority, and something that we have to watch out for from the oversight view. That if you just feel like your country needs you to stick the cattle prods to this terrorist, and being this totally exaggerated hypothetical, that if you feel like your country will fail if you don't do this specific unethical act, that's harder to push back against in some cases. I know I'll draw on that, but I will take just a minute to point out something about Stanford. Anybody has not heard of the Stanford Experiment? Good answer, okay. So you've all heard about that. A few years later, guess who the main defense witness was for Chip Frederick, one of the main instigators at Greb? Dr. Phil Zimbardo, 30 years after Stanford, shows up at the court-martial to testify that everything that these people did was totally predicted by his experiments in the early 70s. Now, does that let these folks off the hook for what they did? Of course not. Is there maybe some it ties into oversight and ethics and people doing the right thing when other people are watching. You've got a closed environment of people who were being directed by sort of faceless people with no name tags or rank to do this stuff for your country, and they did it. Now, the argument at the time was, it just so happens some weak, wicked people happen to be in charge of prisoners, this would happen. But by all accounts, these were totally normal soldiers, just like the Stanford undergraduates who did those terrible things in a fake prison. There's a lesson there about leadership and ethics, and how you build an environment where this doesn't happen. And this does not include saying, well, I know you're a bunch of career NCOs with great records, and therefore I can leave you alone for a few months with a bunch of suspected terrorists, and nothing will happen because you signed your ethical code thing once a year and I can just leave it alone. Constant oversight from without is how you get ethical behavior. And last example I'll say here, anybody's heard of this, don't give away the ending. Briefly, this guy called up McDonald's at 2 in the morning, and over 4 hours, just as Officer Scott on the phone, talked the female manager into strip searching, sexually abusing, and having her boyfriend sexually abuse this young lady whom Officer Scott characterized as an important drug dealer. And again, everyone in the restaurant, the manager knows she's on camera, and she's doing these things. Other employees are walking in and out to get burger packages and straws, seeing a coworker naked under a blanket being abused. They go, oh, well, the manager's got it. There's a thing called agentic shift, which is a tendency in the industrialized age to abdicate your moral compass to whoever else seems to be in charge. There's a classic case here. Once again, in Stanford, what broke the spell was Zimbardo's wife showing up from out of town after 6 days and saying, snap out of it, and making realize how bad things have gotten. In this case, the janitor shows up for the mid-shift, goes, what the hell's going on? Everyone kind of snapped out of it, the girl got her clothes back, and she sued everybody. And so did the manager. She sued McDonald's and said, when I went to Hamburg University, you never told me that I might have anonymous creeps pretending to be the cops and talking me into doing this stuff. McDonald's predictably says, do we really have to have a section in Hamburg U on how not to sexually abuse your employee? Come on. Which seems pretty straightforward. A lot of McDonald's litigation cases kind of have a different view when you get the whole facts. So it turned out that this same guy had called about 70 different fast food places throughout the South with the same approach. And in about a dozen of those cases, he had gotten other McDonald's managers to sexually abuse and rough up their employees. And in all those cases, McDonald's paid out cash settlements with non-disclosure agreements. Now, McDonald's doesn't look so good, right? Yeah, was she just a weak, wicked manager? Doesn't look like it, but it's human nature. We obey impersonal authority. And when they finally caught the guy, who was a correctional officer, they really couldn't get him for anything because he hadn't said, this is Officer Jan's badge number, whatever. He said Officer Scott, which is pretty general, but he had good command voice from being a prison guard. And ultimately, they tried him on one misdemeanor count of impersonating an officer, and he was acquitted. Although all the calls stopped after that, so I guess he was scared straight. But there's a lesson there again about when an impersonal authority directs you by degrees to do something less than less ethical, how have you prepared for that moment? Where is your internal compass you develop to say, I will go this far and no further, no matter what, some guy on the phone, or somebody without a name tag, or even just the general atmosphere of my office that we're here to fight the war on terrorism, and that justifies everything. Where is your ethical red line? Be prepared. That's probably a good stopping point. Just take a quick break to restock on its delicious pastries and coffee, and then in 5 minutes, Bruce will pick up with some other discussions of real-world ethical conundrum. But actually, sorry, I hate it when people say, in closing, and then they keep going. But I do want to allow just 1 minute for comments. So you had something to say? And then we'll hold other comments till we get back from the break.
I just had a question about, you talked about the Stanford experiment versus Abu Ghraib, and I guess technically the doctor in charge of the experiment at Stanford, loosely called leadership, he's really more after the observations. So what would be your comments about the leadership? We're talking about Abu Ghraib being a compliance issue. Yeah. What would you say about the leadership?
Well, my understanding of Stanford was that it was how you wanted to see how people would adopt the roles. But as I'm saying, he himself adopt a leadership role within the experiment. I'm not sure if he was a warden, but he would have the deputations of guards or prisoners come to him, and he would sort of dispense the justice. And so he was, in a sense, part of the experiment. So what little order was being imposed, he was imposing it. But again, he was going to go for 2 weeks, and according to his own book, on day 6, when his fiancée showed up from out of town, she saw her husband has suddenly turned into Mr. Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, right? That he had no conception of how bad things had gotten because he had been in the pot with the frogs as the water got hot for a week. And she comes in and says, this has got awful, these kids are eating each other alive, you're pretending to be in charge, but you're treating like a tin god, what's going on? So then he kind of snapped out of it, and Reader, he married her, and they're still married, so that was a happy story at least. But the point of Stanford is that when there's no leadership, even ordinary people, and 20 Stanford undergrads, they're all dudes because it's 1972, but still probably a straight and narrow and as ethical a branded group as you might find, and they just went down the tubes in a few days. Abu Ghraib, again, you have these guards who are no better or worse than any other educated Americans, and yet they did these terrible things because what little leadership there was, there's really no accountability, right? There's just people with and now the agency was running sort of its own operation elsewhere in the prison. There's he said, she said about who told who to do what, but what guidance they were getting was certainly on the line of, I, the impersonal voice of your country, am telling you to do what you got to do to these SLBs because they're all terrorists. And I'll make one more, no I won't because I promised a break. But I'll finish my piece when we come back from our break and then Bruce. So, go get him. Second breakfast.
Let's take a break for about 5 minutes.
about the enhanced interrogation issues that were brought up earlier in the conference. I think I'll talk for a minute about that because it's a great study on how ethics ties into how you build organizations and oversight and law and politics and all the rest of it. But first, this is something that a previous ethics professor put together for us at NIU. I think he drew from elsewhere to help students come up with a checklist for looking at tough ethical problems in the IC. Time permitting, we'll look at some of those scenarios after Bruce's presentation. But first, determine the facts with little bias as possible. As you got a suspected terrorist being interrogated. You know, he's an evil SOB who did 9/11. That is not an objective assessment. This is somebody who may or may not have done the stuff that you think they did. Only in 24 do you have perfect certainty that that is a dude who has that information about that bomb going off there when. That is a creature of fiction. Who are the stakeholders? And that can be the people in the room who make a decision. It can be the rights of a person being debriefed or interrogated or being run into a foreign country to risk their life. It can be the reputation and standards of the IA or the Army or the Marines or the US government, all the taxpayers who under the social contract have licensed us to have this power of secrecy and make tough decisions, and how do we use that responsibly so that we don't implicate America in something that makes us look terrible and costs us allies later on. And that ties then into, obviously, we'll see ethical dilemma. Is there a right and wrong answer? Would that were the case? It's more often, what is the awful answer versus a slightly more or less awful answer? And how do you justify that down the road? Again, be prepared, right? How have you thought about this before it happens? What are the core values? One thing about the professions is that they tend to have ethical codes peculiar to their profession, right? Law and medicine, duty of secrecy. Makes sense. The American Organization of Church Organ Players has an ethical code. And part of their ethical code is when you move to a new town, do not apply for a job playing the organ in a church without the permission of whoever currently has the gig. And if you violate that, you're out. No more church organ playing for you in our guild. Because they prize fellowship and camaraderie. And they can't have people showing up like organ-playing gunslingers trying to outplay whoever's got the job and then take over as an organ player. That's not the world they want to build as musicians. So they have this ethical code peculiar to their profession, just says, they don't really have to keep secrets necessarily. That's not part of their code, although for the pastor, it certainly is. So what core values of the IC? The IC is such a broad umbrella, it's hard to really, analysts and collectors are very different jobs. These support people have different jobs yet. But duty to tell truth up the chain, obviously, is kind of universal. In the Hadith world, what's your duty to your recruited asset? Do you owe him literal truth about who you are? The correct answer is no, I would argue. Of course, they don't have a duty to the truth. This was a secret operation. Do you have a moral duty not to spend their life stupidly or recklessly? Or because your boss wants, to be able to brag to their boss? Yes, there is a strong ethical duty there, both because you spent a lot of time recruiting that source, and because it's the right thing to do. You want them to think you're partners in a big enterprise to help their country as well as yours. And they understand they're running risks for money. But they should also be entitled not to be sent out on a suicide mission or something so dangerous as to be a suicide mission, with anything less than the country's survival is at stake. Duty to avoid casualties, and law of war encapsulates a lot of these as well, right? Proportionality, distinction, and so on. What are the alternatives? Oh, duty to stand by teammates. That is tricky, right? Any police officers in the room? Okay, me either, but you might ask me this, sir, well, are you supposed to take freebies? Free lunch? I'm guessing it's probably frowned on. But your colleague who maybe has saved your life a few times, they take a free donut or free lunch. Are you going to go straight to internal affairs? There's one ethical code that says, yes, we are, serve and protect, baby. Maintain standards. We don't let each other break the law. On the other hand, are you really going to end your colleague's career because they got a free burger? Come on. But that's the top of that slope, right? Now they're just a little bit too rough with the suspect. Or your fellow interrogator, you're playing good cop, bad cop, and he kind of goes off the deep end a little bit, really hurts the prisoner. But he saved your lives. And the two of you are saving America. At what point do you turn that person in? Are there competing ethical codes here? Each of which has real teeth, duty to your comrades, and duty to the nation and ethical standards of the organization. And those are going to come into conflict more than once throughout your career. Are you prepared to make that decision, whatever it might be? I'm not telling you where to draw the line, but you need to decide and be able to justify it to yourself, and hopefully not to Congress 8 years later. And then the alternatives, right? What is the best or least bad, then the next least bad, and so on. And then you make an ethical decision and you go forward and live your life. I'm going to talk, because a lot of people were talking about intense interrogation, I think it's worth mentioning this. This comes out of my research, but I'll just take a couple minutes and then hand off to Bruce. Hans Scharf came up yesterday. He's famous in American circles, maybe more than in Germany even. He's a World War II corporal who came up with this really, he was fluent in English, he had a great understanding, having been a salesman of human nature, and he was able to use sort of a we-know-all approach, backstopped by some really good analysts, to essentially elicit incredible amounts of information from otherwise on-guard Allied air crews, who years later would wake up at 2 in the morning back in Kentucky and say, oh my God, I told him that? I didn't even realize. He was just so smooth, and he ended his career as a mosaicist for Walt Disney World, so he had a good life. But, what was I going to say about, so his approach and the approaches of the U.S. Marines, Sherwood Moran, and the Pacific Theater were all essentially encapsulated into modern American interrogation doctrine. The approaches you see in the field manual really echo a lot of what Major Moran and Corporal Scharf are doing. For that matter, they echo a lot of what you saw Nicholas Gui in the 14th century writing up for the Inquisition. Where he was writing up good cop, bad cop, and the silent treatment we know all 800 years ago. But DOD has always had a process, right? The military designed by geniuses for execution by idiots, like me. Right? But it also means that interrogation, just like the quartermasters and artillery, has a process and field manuals and training, building, oversight throughout the process. Right? Nobody OJTs being an interrogator in the Army. You have to go through the course and get the license. One of the ethical oversight issues I saw in Afghanistan was a Marine 06 who found out that his major, his flight officer, had once been a Marine enlisted interrogator, so he started roaming the country like Cain, solving crimes with his pet interrogator. That is not okay. That Marine is no longer in an interrogation billet, and that makes it highly illegal for him to do anything more than direct tactical questioning of any suspect. So he had to, but being a loyal Marine, he was kind of going along with it because, again, ethical codes. Duty to your boss, the Marine 06, versus knowing that I really shouldn't be doing this because I'm not in the billet. But DOD has always had this process. Part of this meant that post 9/11, the other part of this, as an organization, DOD, you really can't make that much difference as a military officer. You got 3 years in or out. If you're really good, you make things a bit better. If you're really bad, you screw things up, and the next person fixes it up. Compare that to OSS and CIA, of which I'm a great admirer, don't get me wrong. They spring into existence from the forehead of Congress, 1947, and the first generation of CIA leaders are type A with rabies, throat-biting badasses who all made flag rank at age 30 in World War II. And they designed this organization. The National Security Act says there will be a CIA. It doesn't say how it's going to be organized. So you've got Alan Dulles, Sidney Gottlieb, James Angleton, these guys who set up jobs for themselves for the next 20 years in the same position and really exert outside influence on how the agency worked. And CIA never had really licensed interrogators because why would they? They weren't military, they weren't police. What they had was a Kubrick Manual. Now compare that to the whole pipeline of billeting and training and certification in the Army and the Marines. If you were a case officer in the 60s in the CIA and you had to go interrogate some asset that was kind of suspect, essentially somebody would throw the secret document into your lap on the airplane and say, read that and good hunting. If you read the Kubrick Manual, which was declassified in the 90s, essentially it's a mixture of authorized approaches and then various warnings and advice about things like cattle prods and sleep deprivation to the effect of you better get some high-level permission before you do that stuff, because otherwise you get in trouble. That didn't, And the moral is not that anybody at CIA is amoral or villainous. They're educated patriots doing their best during the Cold War. But the institution was about sending out people to be self-sufficient and mature and get the job done and protect sources and methods. It's fair to say those are priorities in the culture. And that's what you need in that kind of agency. But it meant that post 9/11, suddenly the agency is told, okay, thou shalt receive X number of suspected terrorists to interrogate and detain. They weren't in a questioning or jail business. So out of nowhere, they had to come up with a doctrine. And what ultimately happened was a couple of contract psychologists sweet-talked the agency into this enhanced interrogation routine. They made a lot of money for themselves. Full disclosure, I reviewed James Mitchell's book. He doesn't like me anymore. He's one of the psychologists. But instead of an intensive 12-week in-residence interrogation course, which the DoD had developed, CIA, after about a year, put together a 60-hour PowerPoint course, ran people through it, and called those people interrogators. And most of the horrible stories you hear about from post 9/11 interrogation come out of graduates of that kind of program, where somebody's run through a classroom for a week and told, okay, you're an interrogator, good hunting, go find terrorists. Nobody involved is villainous or incompetent, but the culture wasn't about this sort of painstaking, designed for the stupidest person in the room, building, certification, oversight. It was, hey, we're all a bunch of professional adults and we have a mission to do, and just go question. And so the agency, in its response to the Senate report, freely admitted, managerially, this was a disaster and we're never getting into that business again. Now, there's some pushback on whether the enhanced methods did or did not get more information than authorized pushes would have. And unless I torture you people and question you people nicely and see who gives more information, again, any IRB people, principal investigators, how much paperwork do I need to do that experiment? Probably not going to fly. So it's unknowable. But agency leaders, as angry as they were about a lot of the report, admitted that this could have been handled a lot better, but it wasn't in our culture to have to do this kind of stuff. And so it was kind of a mess. Next time we'll know better. A lot of what we do here, talking about ethics and law and other things, are what mistakes were made in the past, not to call names or scapegoat, but next time there's a crisis and we're all running around with hair on fire, what lessons will we calm down enough to remember from the past? We've got some ethical scenarios based on these to go over. But first, I'd like to hand off to Bruce, because he's got some things that have actually happened and some good ethical lessons to take from them.
Yes, slides.
There were slides. I don't know that they're actually going to make it.
Slide master.
I think what we'll do is simply talk through it. Good morning. Looking around, I see people that are still awake. This is a good thing. I was asked to share a little bit more about background. You've got an abbreviated bio in the program. What the program doesn't tell you is that for about 55 years now, the U.S. Army has run its own version of the clandestine service. You're all generally familiar with the clandestine service, right? Our friends from CIA. Well, the Army did the same thing. I'm retired out of that. I'm a collector, I'm a counterintelligence agent, and I'm an attorney, which, as my wife would tell you, I just can't make up my mind what I'm going to do for a living. Some initial thoughts before we go on. First, it's our privilege to be with you here today. We've had the opportunity from NIU working with the Centers of Excellence program. We hope to have more of those opportunities in the future. Personally, I sent some to Ms. Sanchez, and I don't know if they actually made it through cyberspace.
So it's different set of slides than those?
It's a totally different set of slides. Okay.
First, do you have a USB binding?
Oh, we're from the intelligence community room. Removable media? They would insert it into my body in a place from which it would never be retrieved.
I don't think it made it to Carmen.
Okay, no worries. We'll just go through it. A personal opinion time. I am deeply grateful for the work that you are doing with your students. As you can tell from looking at me, what little hair I have left is now closer to the color of the tablecloths. When I started in this business, we had 3 problem sets in the intelligence community. We had European communism. And we spent huge sums of money working the European communist problem. We had the Asian communist problem, and Russia and the Soviet Union kind of flops back and forth between those two categories. ERC, Vietnam, etc. And then there was the rest of the world. And frankly, we largely ignored the rest of the world because the European communist problem was right in our face. We're going to go to war tomorrow, unless you've been to Korea, in which case you hear on the military-sponsored radio stations, "Be ready to fight tonight." And that's where the emphasis went. The world that we face today is considerably more complex. We need people who are smarter than I ever was, than any of my colleagues were, and you are the ones who are building those. So, first, thank you. Second, thank you. Think of the intelligence community as America's wholly owned multinational corporation. We do business in virtually every country on earth, and we have the same responsibilities as any multinational corporation does. We hire people, we promote people, we transfer people, occasionally we fire people, we retire them. Sometimes we have to bury them. We buy things, we rent space, we acquire tables and cars and all that sort of stuff. We have lawyers and doctors and everyone else, like any other multinational corporation does. And then we have the core business lines: collection, analysis, production. And you are churning out the people who will not only fit into the core business lines, you're churning out the people who may well end up in the rest of the corporate structure. And they will come to us with an understanding of that structure that none of my colleagues ever had. So, again, thank you. Some of the discussion we had yesterday: how much can we brand? How much do we need to protect? That discussion will go on forever. And the reason it will go on forever is that there is a permanent tension between the needs of the intelligence community, which by virtue of its function must be opaque, and the needs of a democratic society, which of necessity must be transparent. You cannot have both. You can have elements of each, but you cannot have both. So please keep that discussion going. The world is changing. One just quick vignette. There are people who will say, you have to be very careful about what you put on social media sites. There will be another argument that says, you shouldn't even have a social media site. And then the counterintelligence people of the world will tell you, if you don't have a social media presence, that in and of itself highlights you. So there really isn't a simple answer. There will never be a simple answer. Now, moving on to today. The piece I was going to talk to you about is a real-world case from the Department of Defense Inspector General. For those of you, and forgive me if I sound like I'm being pedantic, I am a lawyer. For those of you not familiar, the Inspectors General of the government are the ones charged with overseeing what the government does. In the intelligence community, that is crucial because, as has been mentioned multiple times, we live in a closed ecology. We are not transparent. And without transparency, it's hard to have accountability. Without accountability, you can have people with what appear to be good ideas, operating on what appear to be good motives, doing ungood things, like the human pyramid we saw just a few moments ago on the screen. We have 3 senior executives at the Defense Intelligence Agency who were charged with activities inconsistent with their office. One, Mr. James Nanselman, currently head of our Human Resources Department. At the time, he was head of the Mission Services Directorate. That's the piece of the Defense Intelligence Agency that is responsible for things like travel, procurement, contracting, all that sort of stuff. The second was our Deputy Director for Operations, Mr. Doug Wise. He was, at the time, our Deputy Director for Operations on loan to us from the Central Intelligence Agency. The third chap was Mr. David Shedd, who was our Deputy Director and at one point the Acting Director of the agency, also on loan to us from the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Shedd was accused of routinely using government vehicles to transport him from his home to his place of work. Mr. Wise was accused of not using the government contracted air carriers for the official travel that he was required to perform. Mr. Shedd had a similar allegation made against him. Mr. Wise was also accused of not using his government travel card to obtain hotel rooms. Mr. Manselman, oh, it is here. What do you know? Success. Took it a while, but it's not.
Next day. Right here.
Ah. They actually do work. They work better. Go around to, let's see. Okay. This is the report. This is the report.
The right.
Mr. Shedd, Mr. Wise, Mr. Manselman. The allegations. The law requires that government vehicles be used for government purposes. This sounds fairly self-explanatory. What makes things complicated in the case of Mr. Shedd and Mr. Wise is that they came to the Department of Defense on loan from CIA. CIA is a one-of-a-kind organization. As my learned colleague said, the National Security Act of 1947 says, literally, quote, there is a Central Intelligence Agency. And that's as far as the National Security Act goes. 2 years later, the Central Intelligence Agency Act comes along, and it has provision after provision after provision that begin, notwithstanding any other provision of law, the director may, and then you start filling in blanks. One of the things the director may do is approve home-to-work transportation. He can approve use of non-contract air carriers. He can approve use of whatever hotel accommodations come to mind, and a whole bunch of other things. When Mr. Shedd and Mr. Wise came to DIA, they were told, we recognize that you're CIA employees, we're glad to have you, and that's absolutely serious. There's a great deal of cross-pollination within the intelligence community. We're glad to have you, but as long as you're here, I need to remind you of the middle school version of the Treaty of Westphalia. My yard, my rules, your yard, your rules. You're living in my yard, you have to play by my rules as long as you're here. Mr. Shedd was given specific written instructions from the office of the DIA General Counsel pointing out what he could and could not do with a government vehicle. On 43 of his 1,295 days with DIA, and she looked at his use of those vehicles and found that in spite of the guidance, in spite of, and there's actually a federal statute on this. This is how CIA is not bound by the statute because of the exemptive language, notwithstanding any other provision of law. DIA has no such provision, DOD has no such provision. They're working for us, with us, they have to follow the general rule. Didn't. On top of that, Mr. Shedd had need to meet with foreign dignitaries from time to time. And he would meet them at dining establishments outside of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, I have worked for DIA in one capacity or another now for 21 years. I can testify from personal knowledge, the DIA cafeteria is a borderline threat to your health. It has gotten much, much better. That does not mean it is good.
For our possible recruits, it's hit or miss. There are some good days.
It has gotten a lot better. Listen to the man in the corner. It seriously has gotten better, but there is no provision that allows you to use a government vehicle to go eat lunch. And that is what was happening. Failure to use contract air carriers, a number of trips, Washington to Stuttgart, Mexico City, Berlin, London. Of the 4 trips, some of the rationale offered for failure to use the government carrier was understandable, if not legally supportable. Non-stop routing. Nobody likes having to make connecting flights, especially if you're on a tight schedule, and especially if you have lack of confidence in the airline you're flying with. I had an engagement back in November with the Romanian intelligence service. I flew Washington to Zurich, Zurich to Bucharest. Washington, Zurich was on a major US air carrier whose name shall never be mentioned in public, but initials might be United Airlines. And from Zurich to Bucharest on one of the world's lesser known airlines, Swiss Air. I got to Bucharest on time, but apparently my luggage decided it needed a week in the sun, so it went to Cyprus for a week. So I am working with the Foreign Intelligence Service wearing whatever I happened to have on when I was on the airplane. I understand that logic that says, don't use connecting flights, fly nonstop, but the federal travel regulations don't recognize that as sufficient justification. One of the trips was justified because he had meetings immediately prior to departure and immediately upon return where the contract carrier's timetable simply couldn't support it. The problem with this rationale is when the IG looked at the record, none of those meetings ever existed. In this case, the trip to London, the use of the non-contract carrier was completely justified.
Here's another example of ethical codes. Presumably some stuff.
Oh.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Like naturally resonant voice will not suffice. Test. Okay. It's another example of ethical conflict. You want to be part of the team, support your boss, get the mission done. So when you're the GS6 or 7 who's directed to put an entry for a meeting that you know perfectly well isn't happening, you make your boss happy? Are you going to be more Catholic than a Pope and say, sir, you can't do that, that would be wrong. But he's not in a vacuum. There's people around him trying to make him happy, get good appraisals, and more credibly, to get the mission done. The fact is, that they might say, the boss needs to be in the office, these regs are stupid, we'll just kind of bend it, no one's going to check. Any elite or in-group, I think, is more vulnerable to these sorts of creeping ethical lapses. And once the IG gets hold of them, wherever you work, those people are utterly humorless and completely inexorable. They will not decide a weekend, it's okay, you're trying to... No, once a process grinds forward, it grinds exceeding fine, and for months or years, and these reports come out at the end of it. So just don't take this lightly.
In this particular case, could be the script for a 5 to 8 minute comedy sketch on your favorite comedy channel. If you only use contract air carrier going to Berlin, justification? We didn't use the contract air carrier because the other one cost more. Let that percolate for a moment. When he was interviewed, Mr. Shedd indicated that the reason he was making this trip was to meet with senior military officials in a city 800 miles away, which has direct air service. You can fly to Berlin, you can fly to Stuttgart. They are not the same. I've lived in both. They are radically different. This is where things become problematic. Mr. Shedd's response was, faced with these allegations and the evidence the IG had developed, the investigators doing this type of work are federal criminal investigators. They are federal law enforcement officers with all of the investigative powers you would expect from a law enforcer. So it's not simply okay, we looked at it, we don't agree. It's, sir, Here's the record. Here are the records of interviews. These are the people we spoke to. None of this is sustaining your explanation. Make us smart. Help us understand how we got here. His response was, failed to take into account the dynamic and fluid situation the senior leader faces on a daily basis. NSA, NGA, DHS, Homeland Security, State, IRS, they all have senior leaders. They all somehow manage to comply with the rules. So this isn't carrying much persuasive power. He felt it was within his purview to adjust his day-to-day schedule and that he could use a government vehicle for his personal purposes. He thought that was within his authority. Now this is where he may be confusing his prior employment, where it probably was within his authority, with his Defense Department assignment, where it clearly was not. Use of non-contract air carriers. There is something in the collection trade sometimes known as Moscow rules. When you're faced with something unpleasant, you never admit anything. You admit nothing, deny everything, you make countercharges, do everything you can to confuse. That's what this sounds like. It sounds like a Moscow rules approach. In Mr. Wise's case, he used a non-contract air carrier for operationally mandated reasons. He had a specific place he needed to be at a specific time. The contract carrier couldn't get him there on time. And she looked at it and concluded, that's absolutely correct. Mission accomplishment always takes precedence over administrative compliance. Mission got done, no harm, no foul. Failure to use the government credit card when TDY. This may have been an artifact of his previous employment at CIA. DoD requires that DoD travelers use the DoD credit card for all travel-related expenses. He used it to obtain airline tickets. He didn't use it for hotels. When he was interviewed, his response was, I screwed up. I won't do it again. And the IG was happy. In Mr. Manselman's case, he was the one who had to approve Mr. Shedd's use of a non-contract air carrier. When the matter was first brought up, he looked at it and said, no, this doesn't meet the criteria. Further information developed, and it became clear that yes, it did. So when Mr. Manselman was investigated, the IG concurred no fault with his actions. Mr. Shedd could have avoided that sustained both allegations determination by taking a slightly different attitude. Mr. Wise, yes, he had an allegation sustained against him, and he owned it. And the IG recommended essentially no action be taken. In the case of Mr. Manselman, there was no allegation the allegation was not sustained. IG recommended that the Undersecretary of Defense take appropriate action regarding Mr. Shedd and Mr. Wise. In the case of Mr. Wise, the appropriate action was nothing. He had retired, and he'd already indicated he'd taken the necessary corrective action. In the case of Mr. Shedd, he had retired by the time the IG report came out, and that is probably what saved him from criminal prosecution. In 2001, I was part of an espionage prosecution team. We had an Australian national who had access to US classified information, who stole it and attempted to sell it to a foreign country. That country valued its relationship with the US more than the data that Mr. Wispelier, Jean-Pierre Wispelier, they wanted the relationship more than Mr. Wispelier's data, so they turned it back over to the American Embassy. Since we did not have a legal attaché in that country, it was given to the defense attaché. The defense attaché was doing with his government-provided automobile exactly the same thing that Mr. Shedd was doing. And that was why we did not try that espionage case. We pled it out. Because if we had tried it, the only witness we had that could prove that espionage had taken place was a daily violator of the Passenger Carrier Act, which mandates a 30-day suspension for first offense and can result in summary termination for a civil servant. He's the only witness I have. Yet you have espionage on one side, and you've got misuse of a government vehicle on the other side. Weigh in your own mind which of those two is more serious. But I've got to prove this to 12 people on a jury, and it only takes one to conclude that the defense attaché shouldn't be punished. He shouldn't be believed because of what he had done. And Whispeler walks. Thankfully, he had an idiot for a defense attorney. He'd been in pretrial confinement for 2 years. We lured him to the United States on a sting because the Australian, we didn't want to try the case in Australia. They'd only tried, at that point, one espionage case. They lost it. It's usually not an encouraging track record. We lured him to the United States, took him into custody. In custody, he spent a lot of time in the prison library reading and manifested all of the classic symptoms of mental illness. How many of you have had any of the childhood diseases? You know, measles, mumps, that sort of thing. Which was it, man? Measles or mumps? You had both. So you had measles, right? The big swollen glands here. And mumps, all the red dots along your body. Gee, you know that. And so did the prison psychiatrist. Because when Mr. Whispeler came out with his manifestation of mental illness, he had all of the right symptoms, but attached in the wrong order. It was clear. It was clear. He'd read his way through the medical section of the prison library, but he really didn't get it straight. So, full marks for trying. Full marks for trying. The Justice Department guy by the name of Michael Chertoff, who was running the criminal division at the time, authorized a plea bargain and sent Laura Ingersoll, one of his lead attorneys, out. The offer was 12 years, no credit for time served. Last 2 years to be served in Australia, and full participation in a damage assessment confirmed by polygraphy. Unlike what you see in the cop shows, lawyers don't make these agreements. Lawyers have to take them to their clients. Defense attorney says, let me take it to the client. A couple of days later, Laura gets a phone call saying, we have a counter proposal. This is fairly common. Laura goes over to meet with the defense attorney, delightful lady who had never handled a criminal case before in her life, and she has a defendant who is looking at the potential of multiple capital crimes. A lot of chutzpah taking this case on. The counteroffer, 14 years, new time, no credit for time served, last 2 to be served in Australia, full participation in a damage assessment confirmed by polygraphy. Now, if illiterate means you cannot read, innumerate means you cannot add. And the defense attorney may have been even more innumerate than I am. Laura, bless her heart, just looked across the table with a stone face and said, I don't know if I'm authorized to accept that. I'll have to consult with the department. And she told me she got about 6 blocks away before she would allow herself to start laughing. She briefed it to Mr. Chertoff. Mr. Chertoff said, in for a penny, in for a pound, make him a counteroffer. They settled on 16 years. Okay, what happened here? First, you've got a perception of impropriety. One of the challenges we face in the community in which I have spent most of my adult life working is that propriety all too often takes on a different hue. I'm a case officer. I used to recruit spies to steal secrets. I told lies for a living. That's not common in American society. Well, yeah, they're the used car dealers of the world, a few others. But in general, we all have an idea of what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is. And that understanding is colored by the society around us. When you move out of that larger society into a closed society where behavioral norms are somewhat different because of the nature of the community. My wife has learned not to call me on my cell phone because the cell phone lives in my car when I'm at work. I can't have it in the office for understandable reasons. That's a cultural adaptation I've made. There are other cultural adaptations. How many of those cultural adaptations are actually justified, and how many of them are simply habit? Human nature, you're given advice, you're given direction, we tend to interpret it in the manner that is most favorable to our needs. In the specific case of Mr. Shedd and Mr. Wise, you had a different statutory structure between CIA and DOD. They had been briefed on that difference. Mr. Wise got it half right. Mr. Shedd somehow didn't.
Rather than do scenarios, let's take some questions from the audience. Last few minutes.
The single biggest contributing factor, hubris. And that is not limited to senior executives. It is something that affects all of society. I mean, think back in your own schools. How many of you know someone on staff or in your department or in your agency who was absolutely convinced that God gave them a double helping of everything beneficial and you got shortchanged? We call that hubris. The final concept, this top line comes from a famous British court case dealing with not just justice, but the appearance of justice. And the Court of Appeal hearing the matter said, as you see, it is not merely of some importance, but it is of fundamental importance that justice should not only be done, but should manifestly and undoubtedly be seen to be done. You are helping us raise the next generation of intelligence officers who will understand that it is not enough to do right. They have to be seen to be doing right. And with that, we are now in the question mode. Otherwise known as the audience participation portion of this morning's broadcast.
I was trying not to make anyone mad when I was talking to you, sort of tried to make them mad.
It's been a busy week, and we are very much aware that there is only one presentation left before people head for the interwebs. There was a period of time when I taught for our friends at Langley in a training course that was fairly robust, and I was normally the last speaker literally before graduation. The students would leave, go change, and get into their formal attire. And as you might guess, there was a lot of watch staring and other such things. Seriously, do we have any questions or comments from the field?
So I'll ask a question. On that report for the two agents, from an HR perspective, right, what you're saying is they covered policy with them and one followed policy pretty closely to what had been described or perceived to be described, and the other one did not, basically. I'm assuming that, having seen the whole report, I'm assuming that there was documentation that they had been given the exact same information in the exact same way, and they had signed off on all of that.
In writing, yes.
Okay. So that's one of the things I think that is important that as academics we share with our students, that when you are given something, you should thoroughly read it, especially if they are asking you to sign. That is kind of just protocol. I've seen it in work experience, having an HR background, that oftentimes you give employees a packet of information, and we probably have all done this, and assume that what is in there is standard boilerplate, and you sign off on it, and it could be something that is impactful later on down the path. So I don't know if we cover this in normal class time, maybe in the professional development side, but I would say that that's definitely something that we should ensure that our students are paying attention to, because so often we're just, here's a boilerplate, sign it. Whether it be hotel accommodations or whatever, I think just that awareness for students is important.
Thank you, and let me follow that very briefly. In spite of the size of the American intelligence community and the size of the agencies within it, we are nowhere near as deeply staffed as we would like to be. So frequently, the officer working a particular problem, pick your agencies, it really doesn't matter. That officer may be, if not the only, officer may be one of a handful of people working that problem. So the officer's personal reputation for thoroughness, for integrity, for reliability, takes on added gravity, because that officer's product, depending on the topic, could easily sail from that desk straight up to the executive level within that organization. And if the officer has an issue with integrity, if they have an issue with reliability, the agency's reputation is now on the line. And the other follow-up, as was alluded to by my learned colleague, we in the intelligence community exercise authorities that exist in few other places in American society. In some cases, they don't exist anywhere else. If America believes we are misusing those authorities, she will withdraw them or curtail them or restrict them. And I would submit in today's world, that is the worst possible thing that can happen. We don't face a tripolar world anymore, European communism, Asian communism, the rest of the world. We face a multifaceted problem. And we need every authority and every capability America is willing to give us.
Thank you, Mr. McKee. Thank you, Mr. Jens. Thank you very much. You have something to say?
Well, just, we're not going to do ethical stuff, we're out of time, but I will run one quick thing past you for the 90s, and it kind of ties into how ethics ties into intel operations again. Through the Cold War, CIA and KGB had an informal understanding not to track each other's officers. It came out of Berlin in the 40s when it was turning into a bloodbath, and there was an understanding that neither agency could get its work done if its professional officers and their families are being targeted. So the agreement was, go after each other's assets all day long, but no directly killing each other's salaried professionals, and once you retired, you're out of the game. Now that's part of the ethics of, comrades in arms, pilots don't shoot each other in parachutes, that sort of thing. But also, political scientists know that the world's safer if countries have some information about each other's internal affairs. So you want some intel happening between countries, even though we jail spies. You don't want countries to be all black boxes, or you end up with global war. So there's sort of a IR theoretical framework that supports this idea that you need to have some espionage happening. To make that happen, you've got to safeguard and have certain ethical standards of how spies treat each other, spy versus spy. So that was the agreement. So in 1997, a retired KGB colonel comes to Chicago to visit his grandkids. He puts on a customs form, KGB retired, because he relies on the agreement. FBI is waiting for him. They roll him up at the airport because they suspect he was spying in the US during the Cold War, and there's no statute of limitations on espionage. So they've got a social contract between KGB and CIA, now the Russian Federal Service, to which FBI was not a party, and their organizational mandate is catch spies. So who's right, ethically speaking? Should that guy be allowed to walk, or should he stand trial? And we don't have time to game it out, so I'll just say, cut to the chase. There was a big internal battle between leadership at the CIA that said, FBI goes after this guy, all of our retirees or ex-CIA businessmen in Russia, they're all going to end up in Siberia jail in 10 minutes if we don't turn this guy loose, because Putin's going to play hardball. The FBI is saying, that's not our problem, essentially. It went up to the Attorney General, who essentially said, turn the guy loose. Now, FBI, after the fact, said they weren't really going to jail him, but they wanted to squeeze him for information. Even that was seen as out of bounds. And Bruce wants me to stop talking so much. But there's a case where ethics and IR and real politics were all wrapped up together.
Handing a microphone to a lawyer is like giving an axe to Lizzie Borden.
Oh, one more thing.
Okay.
Can
On
we
behalf
give
of
them a round
the
of
team
applause,
here.
please? Give them a round of applause. Let's take a 10 minutes break before our last and final session.
All right, while the last folks are grabbing their drinks and sitting down, I know I'm the last thing between you and a flight out of here for a Metallica concert. I don't know what else is going on. Mariachi bands. Trip down to Mexico. So like some of the other speakers today, my background was in the Army. I come out of the infantry as a sergeant, and then became a combat engineer officer, and then became a foreign area officer, which looks at, is anybody in here foreign area officer background? So we do diplomacy, intelligence, and defense work for the military. There's about 1,000 of us in the Army. So that's what I retired out of. My chunk of the world was the Arabic-speaking world, and I mostly worked on Afghanistan. So I spent my whole career living and working with Muslim communities. Has anybody seen the recent report on beer and alcohol consumption? If you lose 15 minutes of your life for every drink you have over 5 drinks a week, so do the calculation. I died in 1996. I was with a bunch of paratroopers, so are hard-fighting and hard-drinking folks, but it gives me a different perspective on how to talk about Islam. I retired from the Army in 2015. I went back to my small community in North Carolina, and I realized nobody 15 years after September 11th knew anything about Islam, and most people had never met somebody who was Muslim. And the questions I got as I was asked to do guest speaking and talk to Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs and churches were mind-boggling for me, because I had spent my whole career focused on Muslim cultures and studying Islam and working in that part of the world. I was stunned at what we didn't know. And so this started a public speaking career and a teaching career, and along the way I translated the Quran. A couple of you will win one today if you can succeed at these quizzes. And that just launched me into this whole discussion. So I now have a podcast. I threw a couple cards on your tables if you'd like to do podcasts. I do Introduction to Islam, and I interview Muslims from around the world. Yesterday I did a young lady, well, younger than me, but she worked on a film that was nominated for an Oscar. She lives in Toronto and Kabul, Afghanistan, and goes back and forth. And I just let Muslims from around the world tell their stories so that people can understand Islam better. There's no better than to hear from somebody else's words. So that's kind of what I do. I'm going to run you through this course. Hold your questions. I answer just about all your questions you're going to have in these slides. These slides are built from the questions I've gotten over the last 3.5 years. So, and make sure if you do have a question, it's a question, not a comment, so we can get through this. Because there's an exercise at the end of this. I want to pick your brains a little bit. This is something I've been doing for 3 years now with this organization, and I do it in my classes as well. So I want to hear some feedback from you. Has anybody read the Quran in its entirety, the whole thing? Has anybody read the Bible all the way through? Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you the shortcut today. We're not going to go through everything. We're going to touch on some key points, and I think it'll be interesting for you. And lastly, prepare for quizzes. So have something to write on and something to write with, because you'll take some quizzes. You'll let your partners grade you. We want to see where you're at in this. I start with this whenever I speak, because I heard so many people explain over my lifetime, when asked what does Islam mean, they say it means peace. And Islam's a religion of peace. And then I started talking to people across America, and they're like, I don't get this. If it means peace and Islam's a religion of peace, then why are all these guys committing terrorism, saying they're doing it in the name of Islam? Why are they saying they're great Muslims? How do you square that? How do you explain that? And so I was talking with my Islamic studies mentor, who was my teacher in grad school, and he wrote me back an email, and it said this, and I thought it was an easier way to start this discussion, that Islam's just a religion like everything else. Every other religion, belief system out there. It's not good or bad. Those are decisions that man gets to make. Whether you declare a war or not, that's man's decision, not God's decision. So just pull religion up to where religion is and leave the political decisions to man. Okay. So this is what we'll talk about a little bit. We're going to touch on ISIS because I want you to understand what they think, and how they tie what they think to Islam. We'll do some quizzes, we'll do vocabulary, and then we'll talk about what's in the Quran, and then I want to pick your brain a little bit. It's a sticky flicker. Okay, so make 3 buckets in your brain. Make one for Islam, the religion. Anything I say about the religion, put that stuff in that bucket. One for Islamism. That's a political ideology. Think communism, socialism, capitalism. It's got ism on the end, right? That's something that man has decided to do. What an Islamist believes is that everybody, every government action, every government agency, all people should live under a religious rule. So think of us electing a Catholic in the next cycle, and he instantly says, hey, by the way, we're all now Catholics. We all have to go to Mass every week, and your other religions don't really matter. By the way, I can tax you for what you want. So it would probably be pretty unacceptable in America, even for Catholics, that all of a sudden have to go to church every week. I mean, this is going to be a problem. And that's what Islamism is really at the root. There's an Islamist political party in just about every Muslim majority nation in the world. They have different names. You've probably heard of one called the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, and that's where it really all got started in the early 1900s. And then in the last bucket here, put everything that has to do with terrorist organizations, and I put ISIS in quotation marks, because that's just the latest and the greatest. There will be another ISIS after them, and they'll have a different name. But they are violent, they are radical, they want Islamism, but they're not going to vote to get it. They'll kill you to get it, and that's the difference. There are Islamist political parties. They want elections. That's how they want to get power. A terrorist organization that thinks like that they're willing to kill you to do it, they're taking an old Khawarij ideology, which comes to the very beginning of the split of Sunni and Shia in Islam, and bringing it forward. That idea that I can judge you, that you're not Muslim enough for me, and I can kill you if you don't want to do what I say. So we'll get into that today. I want you to understand that concept. Okay, first quiz. Raise your hand when you know the answer. What percentage of these people are terrorists, and what percentage of the worst actually, which percentage are terrorists, kind of worst human beings? What percentage are actually patriots, American patriots? What percentage is what? What you got?
So doesn't it depend on when you would have asked this question?
That's not the answer. What percentage are terrorists? What percentage are patriots?
We really can't judge without the full name.
Thank you. It's just first names.
Right.
That's it. That's the answer. What can you tell about a first name? Nothing. It's just the first name. Here you go. I'll sign it later. I ask this question as I go around America. What do you think I usually hear? It's not, they're just first names. Why? That's a stupid question. What do they usually say? 100% terrorist. Why? Because they're Muslim sounding, they're Arabic sounding, they're Farsi sounding names. Clearly. Trick question. They're all terrorists. They're not, there's no patriots up there. Then I put this up to help them out. All right. What's the percentage here? Terrorists, patriot. You tell me. It's just the first name. But most people don't know that's just the first name, for one thing. And they instantly assume if they see something after September 11th that sounds Muslim, terrorist. Boom, that's all you need to know. But again, most people in America have never met a Muslim person. So they don't even have a chance to get beyond a first name or get to know somebody. But that's part of the issue. In reality, 50% of these guys are Americans who serve their country. 50% are some of the worst terrorists that we've ever chased down or have chased down. One of them is a Navy pilot who works in the IC as in his spare time, and earning Medal for Valor on the ground. It's a Navy pilot in Afghanistan. So these are good folks, and some of them are good friends of mine who died. Okay, how big is Islam? That's a question I often get. It is the second largest religion in the world. That's how far it is behind Christianity. But I have highlighted in red what I think is going to be the largest religion in the next 40 years. Based on birth rates alone, Islam should be bigger than all religions in about 40 years. Birth rates alone. That's not conversions, that's just birth rates, because you stick with the religion you're born into generally. But I think the non-religious movement is growing even faster. And if you haven't seen that in younger folks you've talked to, we're talking to different sets of folks. Yeah?
What about in areas where Islam is the majority? I'm sorry. The non-religious affiliation, is it growing in those areas as well?
Yeah, Islam is going through the same thing every other religion is going through. There are a lot of young folks that are done with religion. They don't like all the things it has caused in the world, and they are moving in the opposite direction. That's just what's going on. That's the growing trend. And if you follow Muslim majority nations on Twitter and social media and watch what they're talking about, watch what the young kids are talking about. They're done. They're done. So I think it's actually going to be faster. But based on birth rates alone, the average today, Muslim women have about 2.9 kids. The average for the rest of the world, 2.2. So birth rates alone, it's going to be the largest religion shortly, but I think it's going to be surpassed. People ask me where the Muslim world is. Well, it is nowhere. There's no such place. But if you had to draw it on a map and say, where do most Muslims live? That's where most Muslims live in the world. Those are Muslim majority countries. There were 50% Muslim in those nations. What's the dark green part in this green map? What's that telling us? Shia. So that's the other major sect of the two major sects. There's a lot more sects. You can buy a book full of all the different sects, but those are the two most people know about. This is where you're going to see growth. Those countries in yellow are 10% Muslim right now. And so you're going to see a lot of growth in the next couple of decades in those particular areas. So they will be creeping up towards Muslim majority status. What are all the red marks on here? Red is bad. What is this map showing us?
Incidents of violent extremism?
Close enough. Incidents of terrorism, as defined by terrorism, for very, very many different reasons. How many Muslims live in Peru and Colombia and Central America? Not many, right? So I try to use this to show Americans terrorism does not equal Islam. Islam does not equal terrorism. You can use anything for a reason to commit terrorism. This goes back about 45 years. If you bring it forward to about just 30 years, yes, most of that's going to creep to the Muslim majority part of the world. And that's just where terrorism's what's been inspiring over the last few decades. Okay, this is, if you've never read ISIS strategy, like what is ISIS thinking? This is their thoughts, and I want you to read it. Take that in for a moment. That's how they see the world. There's us, and we're perfect, and we understand everything, and there's everybody else who isn't as smart as us, and if they don't believe what we believe, we'll kill them. That's the basic theory. So that's the ideology behind how ISIS thinks. It's very similar to Boko Haram, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, you name it. You name the organization that wants an Islamist world and is willing to kill you to get there. This is pretty much their basic strategy. So how do you get ahead of that? That's what we're going to talk about at the end. How do you get ahead of this and get to young folks so they're not taught to believe this, because that's the trick. When they mention the caliphate, this is what they're talking about. That green area from Spain to India. This is about year 750, about 100 years after Islam comes to existence. That's the extent of the Islamic empire at that time, the caliphate, run by a caliph. Caliph is the regent for God on earth. That's what they're talking about. So they want that chunk of the earth back under their guidance, under their belief, under their Islamist political system, and then take over the world. Anybody watch Pinky and the Brain? This is very similar to that theory. You know, we're just going to take over the world tonight. That's the plan. Now, when ISIS jumped up in the world, it surprised everybody and how fast they were able to explode. This is where they hung their banners. That is where they hung their banners. Does this look anything familiar to you? They were serious when they said, we're going to retake the caliphate. We're going to reset those borders, wipe out the national borders, and have one empire. Do I think it's a fool's errand? Yes, I don't know any country in there that's going to cut down its border and join with the country next to it. They have tried in the past. It didn't work out very well. That's Syria and Egypt. So this is their fool's errand, but that's what they firmly believe in, and they will kill you to get there. That's the seriousness of how they see the world. They had taken down the border between Syria and Iraq. They did literally destroy two countries and lock it into one space. So they got there pretty quickly, in a couple of years. This was better than Al-Qaeda ever did. Believe me, they on the ground, wow, this was scary. Today, that's about where they got left. You know, the army on the ground has been kicked in the teeth, been pushed back. Unfortunately, not everybody is still there that went there. We estimate it could be 50,000 foreign fighters that flew into Syria to fight in Syria and Iraq. 50,000 people. We don't know if we've gotten 50,000 bullets to foreheads yet. So this is what we know is left, that space there. But where are these kids being indoctrinated at an ISIS school? Where are they learning that belief that we're going to take over the world, we'll kill anybody who disagrees with us? Is this Syria or Iraq? It's Malaysia. 8-year-old kids in Malaysia. So you can kill any army you want, any militia you want that has this ideology. That's not the solution, because they're still teaching, they're recruiting, and recruiting is where the problem happens. This is not calamari, if you like seafood. That is actually, the head of it is Iraq and Syria, and that's where the foreign fighters have gone back to that we didn't get to kill on the ground. This is where that army has gone back to on purpose. They told us, hey, we're going to hide in the refugee streams and get back out to our home countries and do ISIS bidding from home. We don't have to be in Iraq and Syria. So maybe the caliphate didn't work this time. We're going to go home and start from there. So that's what you're going to be working on, should you go into the IC, for the young folks, for a long time. You're going to be trying to figure out where these folks went and what they're doing. And that is a big mission of what we're trying to undertake right now. This goes back to something that a Marine Corps general named Krulak came up with, which was repeated to me by one of my mentors, General Lamb. You can't shoot an ideology. You can't bomb an ideology. You got to make it an argument, have an argument, and win the argument. You've got to change minds, which is kind of what I've been running around America doing, trying to help people understand Islam a little bit so they're not believing stereotypes and myths, and they actually use some facts. But the same is true if you're going to stop the next ISIS. You've got to talk about their ideology, understand it, explain it, get it out there, get young kids to understand it. That's hard to do, but that's where you got to start, because they're recruiting 8-year-olds. And if you look at the news, it's not too good as far as spreading it. And I'll just highlight one point on there. Yeah, there's going to be another ISIS popping up somewhere. It may not come up in such an explosion. Now we know what to look for with that, with social media. They hit that just right with the social media craze, but 250 ISIS recruiters arrested in Malaysia. How many people does one recruiter touch? If they arrested 250 recruiters, how many kids did they already get and start to indoctrinate? That's the trick. This is hard to get ahead of. It is very, very challenging. So let's talk about the Quran a little bit, talk about Islam. That's the Quran in Arabic. Do most Muslims speak Arabic? You said no. Absolutely, they do not. Like there's what, 400 million people that speak Arabic, 420 million? So most people that have to read the Quran are reading a translation of it. Somebody had to put it in another language. Depending on where that translation was done, who did the translation, who approved it, those books can be very different. I've collected a lot of Qurans, as you might guess, and having done one of these interpretations myself, they're all very different depending on who did the translation. All right, here's your first big quiz. Take out a pen and paper. You got just a few minutes, so it's either in your head or it isn't. Crank these out. See some smoke rising. That's good. Worth thinking. I've only had 100 on this, so break the record. Most of these are short answers, so if you're writing more than a couple words, just move on. One more minute, speed round.
We have a question.
Do we get partial credit for being close on number 9?
That's up to God to decide. You almost get to heaven, or you're going to the other place. I'm not going to judge you. I think that's going to be left up to God. Okay, go ahead and trade papers. Let's see what you got. This is also a handwriting legibility test to see if you'll make it in the IC, because someone's got to read your crappy notes. All right, number 1. If you didn't get that one, you probably should leave now. Okay, number 2. Again, I hope you figured that one out. I don't know if I mentioned his name yet, but I tried to write the quiz so I wouldn't give it away. Muhammad. Do Muslims believe in one God? Yes, very much so. One God and not the Trinity. Cannot be divided, one God. Do they believe Jesus is Son of God? No, of course not. If you don't believe in the Trinity, then he can't be the Son of God. Any foods they cannot eat? Yes, they are spelled out. There are more than 10 commandments in the Quran. Let's just say. And it's very clear about food. Do they believe that some of the biblical characters you know are prophets? Yes, absolutely. True or false for Muslims? Is this a continuation of the same 2 religions that came before it in that region? Yes, this is a continuation. About how many people in the world are Muslim? Who got that one right? All right, that one was given to you prior, so I hope you got it. About what year did the revelations start to come to the Prophet Muhammad from God through the angel Gabriel? Around 610-ish. He held on to this for a little while before he started to speak, because he thought he was going a little nuts with what was going on. But when he started to speak, they told him, I think you're a prophet. Go for it. So he continued. Where do people go on pilgrimage? Mecca. I think most people know that. And then the 5 key religious requirements there. The profession of faith, that's a tough one to get. Most people miss it. Fasting, charity, prayer, and pilgrimage. And I'm using English words here. And I'm not speaking like a theologian, if you haven't picked up on that. Because guess what? People in America can't understand that. Not because they're ignorant, because that's not the language people in America speak in anymore. So it's quite pointless to stand up here as if I'm some theological scholar and bore the heck out of people. They won't get it. I've seen people try. I tried. You need to change your language to the audience. So who got all 11 correct? 100%. We got a winner? Look at that. Yeah, that's, you tied the record. We only had once before. That's awesome. Congrats. Did you learn anything on there that you didn't know before?
Yeah. I misconstrued. They do believe that Jesus is a prophet, right?
A prophet, but not the Son of God.
Son of God.
Yeah, that's the big distinction. Okay, good job. Let's go over a few key terms. These you need to know if you're going to make sense of this whole process here we're going through and really to function in the world today if you end up looking at this part of the world. All right, we know Islam is a religion. We've now said it is part of the big 3 there for that region. This is the continuation of that. Sunni and Shia, those are the 2 big splits. Actually, the first sect to break out was not either of those. It was the Khawarij sect, which is the ideology which ISIS draws upon. The Khawarij were so pious and so devout and thought so much that they knew exactly how Islam was supposed to work that they told the Caliph, Ali, who would later become Shia, that he's wrong. And if he doesn't correct himself, we're leaving. So that is the first sect to actually pop out. It's the one that most people don't know about. I did my grad school work on this, so I spent a lot of time going to the country where it still exists and talking to people and trying to understand it. So just know that that's a very, it's almost a curse word in the Muslim world. If you call somebody Khawarij, that's a bad thing to say to somebody, and we'll talk about that later. Sunni and Shia. I'm going to break this down into really simple terms for now. You can dig into this later. Sunni is the largest, about 85%. And to me, I look at it, it's a little more Protestant in its views. If you understand Christianity at all, you've got your holy book, you've got God, and you can chat. And if you have a question, you go to your local mosque and you ask your local mosque and prayer leaders, you know, what about this? I have questions. And that's a little more direct, right? It's kind of the Protestant view of things. The Shia side is a little more Catholic in the way they do things. There's a hierarchy of human beings on earth in which you can ask, you know, cardinals, bishops, popes, that type of idea. Shia is even better, though. You can pick your own pope. There's more than one at the kind of pope level, so you go with the one traditionally your family follows, but you can go the one you agree with more, which is kind of handy. I know some Catholics sometimes want to pick different popes, but there is no other one. So that's the real big difference. It's the same Quran. It's in Arabic, it's exactly the same Quran. You will find in other languages there are kind of Sunni versions and Shia versions, and they talk more about why it's okay to have this theological stepping stone and Shia side of things to reach God and ask for answers. There's a great website that the Grand Ayatollah Sistani runs out of Iraq, where he literally has a Q&A section in English and other languages, and you can read what Muslims have written to him and said, hey, you know, if my daughter wants to marry a butcher, but out of the back of his market he sells pork to Christians, is that okay? Is that halal? Is that kosher? So, and he'll answer them. He has his folks looking at it. He's got his cardinals and bishops in there, you know, and they're trying to figure out what this means. And it's a great way to learn about it, but that's a little bit different. On the Sunni side, people like that exist, but they're just considered religious scholars. They really don't have a place in the hierarchy. They just probably work at some religious school somewhere. So that's really the big difference. It's about how you live on earth. Again, same Quran, same rules. And this split comes around, we'll talk about it a little bit later, the split. The Quran, the holy book, this is the recitations of Muhammad. He is reciting what God told him through the angel Gabriel. Yes, that angel Gabriel. So that's what the Quran is. That's the exact word of God. So in Arabic, the exact word of God hasn't been changed since it was written down 20 years after Muhammad passed away. So that is why people hold the Quran in Arabic to be a holy book that should be touched. Some people only touch it with gloves on if it's in Arabic, because that's the exact word of God in the language he spoke to reach that population on earth. That's kind of the sign of the difference there. The Hadiths, these are numerous books, and they list all the things that Muhammad may have said or done in his lifetime that were written down by somebody who observed him doing it. And not all Muslims agree on which Hadiths are correct and which are not. That's a whole other line for it. I just want you to understand they exist out there, and they are also used in the legal world inside of Islam when you're talking about Sharia. The Sunnah, you notice the word Sunnah and Sunni are very similar. The Sunnah is how Muhammad acted. What was he like as a role model? Because he's a prophet. Remember those "What would Jesus do" bracelets? This is what would Muhammad do. This is thinking about, you know, if I'm in this situation, what would Muhammad have done as a prophet, as a good, honorable man, a respected person in his community? That's how I want to live my life. So the Sunnis very much cling to that idea. I want to live like Muhammad did and follow his path, because it was the straight path. You know, God chose it for a reason. Then we get to Sharia law, which in Arabic that would be saying law, but Sharia, this is all the do's and don'ts that are in the Quran. And I actually made an index in the back of mine to put them all in one spot so you can look up all these commandments, because there's more than 10, and it would take a long time to make a list. So I just put the page numbers in there so you can go back and read what all these different rules are. It should be the same in every country in the world that has Islam as an influence on its man-made laws, on its constitution, on whatever it has, whether they just use straight Sharia, which is strictly religious, or they combine it. But Islam is one of the younger religions in the world. So most of these nations where Islam is the centerpiece of their law, just like we kind of took the Bible as the centerpiece in our country, those countries already had laws long before Islam came along. So there's a mix in many countries. If in some back valley of Pakistan, they say if the punishment for a woman who commits adultery is to push a wall over on top of her, it might not be in the Quran, but to them it's Islamic law, because they're now Muslim and it's still the law and how they see the world. So there are differences everywhere you go about how it's actually interpreted, applied, but it should be exactly the same because you're using the same text. Caliphate, we already discussed, that's that religious empire. Jihad, no one's heard of that one, right? I can move on? Okay. This one confuses a lot of Americans, so I spent a lot of time talking about this, but the verb in Arabic means to strive or to struggle. That's it, that's the whole connotation, to strive or struggle. And then you apply it to what shows up in the Quran. It must be on every page of the Quran, right? It's mentioned in the news every night by some real academically sounding idiot. You know, it's got to be on every page. How many times did it actually show up in the Quran? 14 times. That's it. And there are a lot of verses. So that's about it. What it means in the context of the Quran, really there's two different things that it talks about. One, to struggle or strive as a human being to be the best Muslim you can be and to make your religion as good as you can be. And then defensively to defend your religion. Because Muhammad was under attack immediately after starting this religion, right? He gets this community, he leaves Mecca because he has to, and he goes to Medina, and he's under attack, and the Meccans are trying to hunt him down and kill him and shut down his religion. Because as we'll see, it's kind of shocking for its time period what it's telling people to do. It's disrupting the order of Mecca. So his family, his cousins and uncles are trying to kill him because they're not Muslims yet. And so that's what the jihad is talking about in the Quran. It's specific, it has a time period, it's set to that. After 1979, it got very violent connotations attached to it with the invasion of the Soviet Union and a couple other things, and it became common speak for violence. But I'll share with you somebody who practiced jihad in a different faith. There's a young woman who lives in the caliphate under the Ottoman Empire, and she goes to her family and says, I want to be a religious person. I want to do something for my religion. They say, okay, you should join the religious organization then and study. So she did, and she did very well, and she was very pious, and she was very noble. And they said, you're a really good person. You're very strong in religion. We're going to send you to India. We want you to set up your religion in India. And she went there and she started taking care of the poor and the sick and the needy and the orphans. And she spent her whole life struggling. Her whole life was this jihad to make herself a better religious person and to make her religion stronger. And when she died, what did the Catholic Church call her? Mother Teresa, a saint, right? So that's what I try to explain to people, especially who love to throw this word around as if it has a negative connotation. You're literally calling a terrorist a saint when you call him a jihadist. He's happy to hear it. He wants to be called that. He thinks he's going to heaven because you're calling him that. That's how stupid you are to carry the propaganda for your enemy and call him something wonderful. Would you call a terrorist who is fighting for Christian white supremacy in America a saint? No. You'd call him a terrorist. There's a title for what he is. It's very specific. He wants, white supremacism, and he's a terrorist. That's what you call him. You call him a coward, a butcher, a murderer, whatever. You don't call him a saint. And this is something I'm trying to beat into the heads of people who talk about this for a living, especially in counterterrorism policy, to understand you shouldn't call the bad guy something he wants. It kind of goes against how the world works. Islamism, we talked about that. This idea that you want everything to function under religious governance. Salafism and Wahhabism, two words you hear a lot. Salafism, the idea comes out of Egypt. It is that concept that we want to go back to the old days of Muhammad and live like he did. So a very Sunni or Sunnah-based focus. And Wahhabism comes out of Arabia, really the same idea. I want to go back and live in those. So you'll find people who follow either of those persuasions, really just a view of Islam, going to be very conservative. They want to go back to the old times, get rid of modern things. That's what you see those about. And then I put the folks that, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, the folks who will kill you to get Islamism down at the bottom here. Most terrorist groups in the world, they like that Khawarij ideology. They think they're better than every other Muslim. So the first people they kill who disagree with them are usually Muslims. They're not hunting Christians and Jewish people. They're hunting Muslims that live right next door to them. There are a lot of sects of Islam. I'm not going to go into them all, but I want you to understand it's bigger than one monolithic label you can stick on everybody. And this little bitty teeny tiny one in Oman, the Ibadi, that's all that's left of the Khawarij after centuries of moderation. It's actually one of the most open places to be any religion in the world today. It's kind of surprising where time turns out. So there's a lot of sects, just take away. Then there are schools of Islam. These are mostly legal schools. That's a whole other ball of wax. Dig into that if you like. The Sunni-Shia split. This comes about not over a disagreement in how the Quran should be enacted and what the Quran says, but really who's in charge of this caliphate. Ali, who is the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, basically raised beside him as a brother underneath his father. He is supposed to be the caliph. He's ordained the caliph, but a Khawarij had killed the caliph before him. It's going to cause a problem because the Khawarij were kind of aligned with Ali's partisans in being Shia in Arabic. So that's going to cause a split. And the other side, the other side of the family, they're all Qureshi. The other side of the family is going to say, no, we should be in charge. And you killed our family member. So this starts a war over power. And at this point, the Khawarij leave all the other Muslims, and then the Shia and the Sunni will kind of split up as well. And that's the first sects that break out of Islam. Another long story you can go into. But the Khawarij, really, what I want you to take out of this, they truly believe they are the only ones that are doing Islam right. That Ali, who is the son-in-law and the cousin of the Prophet of Islam, doesn't understand Islam. That they do and he doesn't. And if you come in their territory you wander off into their areas, they will kill you, they'll behead you, they'll rob you, they'll take your women as slaves, they'll take your children as slaves. Sound anything like what ISIS was doing? This is that mindset. It's an ancient thing. And so again, this is a word you want to use if you describe those folks. Anybody ever seen this bumper sticker on the back of an ISIS truck? If the Khawarij had a bumper sticker and a song, this is probably what it's going to look like. They're going to sing "Onward Muslim Soldiers Marching as to War." They're going to have a bumper sticker that tells you real Muslims, as if there's unreal and real Muslims. Real Muslims obey all of his teachings. Anybody ever seen those on the ISIS cars? Has everyone captured? This is where that has actually come from. That is a billboard that hangs on the side of I-95 quite frequently as you go up to D.C. from North Carolina. I see it a lot when I drive to D.C. It's been changed to something kinder lately, but for years, this is what it said. As if there are real Christians and not real Christians. It's the same mindset that you as a person that's really religious can judge another person as to not be good enough for you. And that's really where this problem stems from. And that song always struck me. I went to a funeral and somebody was singing that and I listened to the words. I grew up with that in my church, but I never listened to the words and really thought about what that says. Talk about putting religion and violence together in a song. Probably not the best of routes to go. All right, so what's in the Quran? About 114 chapters, over 6,000 verses. I tell people, think of each chapter as a sermon. In non-chronological order, which is the way it usually is written, they kind of go longest to shortest. Nobody exactly knows the reason why they're ordered that way. It's just how it ended up. And that's not really open for debate. Nobody knows. 6,000 verses. The verses get longer as well as the book goes along chronologically. And if you'll see in my book, you're going to notice that these sermons, these chapters, these recitations are going to get longer. Has anybody seen a new preacher versus an old preacher in a church before? They start out a little shaky, they're reading right from the Bible. They're pretty short, they finish on time. 10 years into it, they're not even looking at the pulpit. They're wandering around and they know everything and they memorize it. And they're just adding on every week when they talk. That's how sermons work. You get better at it. I've been doing this for 3.5 years. I don't have notes. I'm just talking, right? That's how life kind of works. It took about 23 years for it to be revealed and recited. It ended, of course, when the Prophet Muhammad ended. So that's the end of the recitations. It took another 20 years for it to be put together into a book, into the Quran we know today. And that was about the third caliph, Uthman. It's kind of the King Uthman version. That's what people in the world know today. That's what it looks like. But, as I mentioned earlier, most Muslims don't speak Arabic. 1.7 billion. So most people need a translation. That's where your issues really could start to happen. It can still happen in Arabic because anybody can add footnotes and parentheses and indexes and appendixes to any book, right? That's what you do when you publish a book. That happens. Why did I interpret it? I think it's hard to read a book that's not chronological. If you've tried to watch a Shakespeare play with 114 acts out of sequence and made sense of it, your brain is better than mine. I couldn't do it. I tried for 20 years. That's what I did. I think it's hard to read some of the old English that exists in them. And I think these additions that get added to books are kind of problematic. And so I wanted to pull all those out. You'll notice there's hardly any notes in mine. It's just what the Quran said in Arabic, in English. This is a great sample I love to read to people. And there is not a thing but with us are the stores thereof, and we send it not down except in a known measure. That's a very popular Quran in English. Does that mean anything to you? Because I read it a lot before I could figure out what they actually meant. And I had to pull into other books to figure out what they were talking about. That's the difficulty of many that you pick up. So there's a good 5 or 10 good ones out there in English. Grab one of those if you're trying to read it. What's in the Quran? This is shocking stuff for most Americans. These are concepts you've never heard of before in a religious text. So I went through and I analyzed the Quran. Like, what is in here? What's in here most frequently? What are the big messages? That's the gist of a book. Has anybody read a religious text, anything like this? Yeah. They all kind of go there. Who are the stars of this? If this is a 114-act play, Who's on the playbill? Again, people you've never heard of in your life. I know more about Moses and the Pharaoh from my work on the Quran than I ever learned in Sunday school as a Baptist. That's a very popular story in the Quran. You will learn about Moses and Pharaoh. And Jesus and Mary are in there more than Muhammad. That's why he's at the end there. Muhammad is, by name, is actually mentioned less than Jesus. He's usually referred to as the prophet or the messenger. These are the messages. Again, stuff you've never seen in a religious text. If you just pulled out the big messages in the Quran. You've never heard about faithful community or codes of conduct. You've never heard about heaven and hell, prayer, judgment day, resurrection. All this stuff is new to you. It'll be surprising when you pop open this book and go, oh my gosh, this is revealing. If you make a cool word cloud, I do this for the young folks, this is what pops out. Faithful. Faith being one of the biggest concepts in the book. Forgiveness. Forgiving. Actually, I love that Moses pops up. Moses is one of the most used words. I took out the word God and the, because that would have made this really a weird looking chart, but this is what it talks about. These are the big messages that you can pull out. If you literally analyze, if you get it into a Word document and can literally sort through the language that's in the Quran, that's what's in it. If you put it on a cool pie chart for the older folks, there's a lot about God, right? That's a big chunk of a religious book. And then it goes into heaven and hell, good and evil, kind of works its way down from there. As you can see, almost imperceptible on the chart, there's this concept of jihad that everybody loves to talk about when they speak about Islam. It's pretty hard to compare those. There are controversial verses. Yes, you can go in the Quran, just like you can go in Moby Dick, and pull out things that you want to use to inspire people to commit violence. You could point to them. And I mentioned people were trying to kill Muhammad after he started this religion. His cousins and uncles are literally battling with him. They're trying to cut his head off and kill him. So there are moments in the Quran, because he's still reciting what God is telling him during all this, when you can find these. And these are the big three that most Khawarij type groups are going to pull out. If you meet an unbeliever on the battlefield, you strike him in the neck. That's why you see all the beheadings. They literally are thinking this is a very religious thing I'm doing. But who's the unbeliever? Who's the infidel in the Quran? Are they Jewish? Are they Christian? They're pagans who live in Mecca. They're idol worshippers. They're multi-god worshippers. They're his family. These are Muhammad's family. That's literally what God is telling Muhammad. Those people aren't Muslim yet. Kill them. So that's what the discussion is. So what you see it applied to other things. It's not in the context of what's in the Quran. God remembers and takes care of those who die in his way, his path, who are struggling. They're going to go to paradise. So that's why you see the belief that, hey, if you die doing this and we're doing this as a holy war, if we're going to turn this into a jihad somehow, you're going to go to heaven. And then the last one, this is where the Khawarij make their money. You can question another person's faith. If you don't think they're struggling with all their person and wealth in the way of God, you can make that judgment. You're not a real Muslim. You're not Muslim enough for me. That's where the Khawarij made their money. And that's where groups like ISIS really get their power from. That ability to judge a man on earth and not wait for God to do it. And that's where they're going to point to in the Quran to get their justification for this. Again, they don't care about context. That's not what they're in the business of. They're in the business of recruiting. There are a lot of verses, these didn't make the people in Mecca very happy. It did help spread the religion, that are very helpful to women. Compare this to what the Vikings were doing in the 600s as you read through these. What were the Vikings saying compared to what Muhammad is telling people? That widows should be treated respectfully. There should be rules for how you divorce somebody. You just can't divorce them for no reason. That you should have to take care of your ex-wives. That one made it into the laws. Men and women are equal in all things. That is a verse in the Quran. It can't be mistranslated any other way. It's literally what it says. There are rules for inheritance. Women can now inherit property. 600s. Were Viking women getting property in the 600s? How about in America? When did women start inheriting property? It was not in the 600s. Let's be clear about that. This is radical stuff for the time in which he is saying it. And so this caused a lot of problems for him, and it kind of disrupted society. That's a big piece of the puzzle. I put an asterisk on this, though, because the world is run by men, for the most part, right? And especially in the 600s, and especially, until, 2006, maybe. These two in red, that women should be treated honorably, sounds like a good thing. That men have to protect women, it's their responsibility to protect them. What can you use if you're a male-dominated society? What can you use those for that will keep women from reaching their potential? Well, the best way to be protected, and for me to protect your honor, is that you be covered head to toe and you stay in the house and you don't go to school and you never meet a man who isn't related to you. Everybody's a lawyer when it comes to rules, right? No different here. The men running the society over the centuries figure out ways to do this. Did they do it in other religions? Yes. This still exists in many other religions as well. Many men use this loophole to keep women in check. So be aware of that. But that's kind of the big difference between those. These are my favorite verses. I often get asked this, so I went back through the Quran and said, what really jumped out to me? One, you should choose to forgive when you're angry. Again, a concept you've never read in another text about religion. That God rewards the best, those who forgive and reconcile. And the last one really sticks out to me. The most courageous way to act in life is to forgive and be patient. Can't misinterpret that. The most courageous thing to do in life is to turn the other cheek. Have you heard this from anywhere else? Those jumped out to me when I read that. And most people do not know that's in the Quran. That's not what you're ever told. Those aren't the stereotypes. What gets added to it? So it gets put into other languages, or it gets translated, into new editions into Arabic and distributed around the world. And some countries spend a lot of money shipping Qurans, building mosques in other countries, sending out prayer leaders to those mosques. They can add whatever they like, because it's a book, and you can do that. You can put it in the beginning, you can put it at the end, you can put parenthetical notes throughout the book. There are some pages in some of the Qurans that I've read where it's 1/3 actual words of God and 2/3 explanation of it. And you can write whatever you like in there. And if you're writing in a country that believes in Wahhabism, say, you're going to get approval of that copy, and it's going to go out by the millions to different mosques around the world for free. Has everybody ever thrown away a free book they've been given? If it's your religious text, no, that's the one you got. That's the one you refer to. This is an investment by people who want to radicalize people to a certain point of view. They can use this technique, translation. How do you counter that? That's the tricky part. That's the question. If those Qurans exist, and those prayer leaders and preachers exist, that are trying to lean people in one direction or another, how do you counter that? That's the tricky part. Why do people join ISIS? It's not because they're poor and don't have a job and are uneducated. That is a big myth, and you need to understand that going in. There's been a lot of studies done about why people join ISIS, because they were pretty open. They would talk to journalists, they would talk to scholars. Why are you here? They're there for many reasons, and a lot of these people are very smart. Are they your suicide bombers? No, that's them taking some unfortunate young soul and putting him out there to do it. These aren't your smart folks, but they'll use somebody else to do it. So just understand that. And ISIS was different. They weren't worried about what class you were in. They weren't worried about your education. They just wanted to hear from you. Their slogan was literally, don't wait for us to find you. Just contact us. Reach out on social media. Send us a tweet. We'll take you. We're happy. All right, what do? How do you solve this problem? If you've got a lot of young folks getting radicalized into groups like ISIS and the Taliban, how do you get ahead of that? And I've heard lots of different solutions over the years, and I want to just pick your brains a little bit. So this would kind of be the dividing line. If you're on this side, you're Group A, and from that table over, you're Group B. Group A, what do? How do you get ahead of this? How do you change this story? Group A, give us a reason or a technique or something the world can be doing to fix that problem of radicalization. How do you get ahead of it? Group B, think about why that's going to be hard to do. Whatever the answer they come up with, why will that be challenging or hasn't been tried before? So Group A, anybody raise your hand. We're rapid fire, so don't think too hard here. What do you got?
Education.
Education.
Changing the narrative.
I like that first answer. Why is this hard? B.
Cultural boundaries. Mistrust.
Trusts, cultural boundaries.
Language, yeah.
Language barriers.
Patriarchy.
Yeah, you're fighting against some very old systems here, but it is a critical piece. All right, so Group B, give me an answer. How do you get ahead of this radicalization problem? What do? What's the solution? We've got education on the board. What can you do? What does the world do? When I say we, I'm not just talking about America. What's the world need to do? I'll repeat your answer if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, we should do the same thing they're doing, a social media campaign. It is education. But
Social media. If they are using social media to get kids to go one way, we need to be better at doing it the other way. That's a great point. What's hard about that? Group A.
You see it as an immediate need, and it's a long-term process?
Yeah, we're very antsy about taking the long-term view on this project. So we're just trying to do something rapid fire. That's a great point.
The majority of people currently fighting this are an older generation that don't entirely understand social media themselves.
Yeah, so how do you reach the older folks? That's a tough market. Social media has a market. You know, how do you get into that other one? Okay, another solution over here. Go ahead.
Actually, I had been thinking about this one earlier. Pop culture. And the reason I say pop culture is if you can show more images of inclusivity of everyday people as well as young Muslims, showing them as just young Americans or young Indonesians or young whoever, whichever country it is.
Okay. What's hard about the pop culture technique? What makes that difficult? And I'll repeat your answers, just throw them out. Why is it hard to compete in pop culture?
Because not all of them are supported by religious beliefs.
Yeah, you've got other terrorists who, you're not going to be reaching them through this argument. We saw the reasons people join ISIS. It's not always about religion, even though it's a religious, dominated idea. What else? Pop culture angle. If that's the way you want to take this on, what's hard about that?
I think it's hard to engineer pop culture.
Yeah, that's a great one. And I've worked with some folks who are trying to do this stuff. It's hard. One of the lessons they've learned, I'll share with you, is don't try to invent it. Go find somebody who's a pop culture icon who's doing all those things that you want and promote him. Promote the good ideas. Promote that other view. Because if you try to make up pop culture, you end up a one-hit wonder. So that's a challenge. What else? Anybody? What other solutions are there? We'll just rattle them off here. Save time. Employment. So some of the people who turn to this do not have a job. They don't have a good path in life. So economics plays a part in this. You do need to have good economic systems around the world where you do always have kind of a ready-made population. Yeah.
Like a Marshall Plan.
A Marshall Plan to fix that. Yep, that has been talked about. We actually talked about that after September 11th and never did it. A Marshall Plan of some sort to actually change the dynamics in the countries where recruiting is the easiest. Yep.
So one step further would be diplomacy.
More diplomacy. Right. Elaborate on that.
Robert Gates told, as Secretary of Defense, volunteered to give up funds to the State Department because they knew that if they invested in the diplomacy in the State Department, if they didn't do that, then they would have to use all the money in the DOD to fight kinetically.
Okay. Those are all, yeah, go ahead.
We have to do the opposite of what they're doing in some parts of Europe. The isolationism and having people who are from different cultures live in segregated areas. So integrating them better into society.
A better integration program. Man, that is huge. France has got a big problem on its hand. France will be one of the Muslim majority countries in the next 40 years. They already are at 10%. They're going to be one of those countries affected by it. And the problem is, if you're not French, and you were born in French, and your family's lived in France, you're never going to be French. And you might live in a segregated part of some of the cities. They're going to have a huge problem with this. If you're not integrated, you're not part of the society.
So all of this is about what we do to them, right? But I think you can't fix this unless you undertake a deep consideration of our own culpability in creating the problem.
Okay, so you have to understand the problem fully in everybody's. And I mentioned we doesn't mean America. We that we're talking about, this is the world solution. This is Muslims solving this problem, right? This is not America. We're not a Muslim majority nation. What pull do we have in the world? We can affect it. We might even negatively affect it in many ways. But these solutions have to come from a larger group of people, which is all of humanity. I'm going to give you just a couple things to take away. This was what happened after the last administration shift out. I know this because I watched the conversation. There was a lot of questions about, are we doing this right? What are we doing that's making the problem worse? Are we fighting terrorism? Can you ever actually kill an idea like that? Actually, no. Are we fighting violent extremists? Is that specific enough? Does that actually help? Has that motivated our friends and allies around the world to do something? And the decision was, we've got to get to the ideological underpinnings. This is all about ideas. That's got to be the solution, not about bullets and foreheads. We're good at that. There's guys at Fort Bragg who go hunting every night, and they never miss. These guys shoot guns all day long. They are excellent marksmen. They will never miss the target. But does that solve the problem? You've got to get to the ideology, and that's what was decided by this administration. And I teach counterterrorism policy. This has been an evolution since Nixon first declared a combat on terrorism. Nixon, combat on terrorism. All right, we've been adding to this policy for years, but that was the big discussion. That came out in Trump's Riyadh speech. We want peace in your region. We've studied your issues. We're here to assist you. Muslims have to take the lead. The problem's ideological, not military. We have to act together. You have to do this. America can't fix this problem. This was the 55 Muslim nations sitting in Riyadh having this discussion. We know what the problems are, but it's not America's to solve. You've got to want to take this on. You've got to drive out the ideology. You've got to cut off the financing and no more sanctuary. Pakistan was not invited to this conference by the other Muslim nations for a reason. That became the policy for the counterterrorism. But that wasn't really us coming up with this. Our ally, King of Jordan, has been calling the enemies the Khawarij and that ideology and saying they're tainting our religion. We need to take it back for years. This wasn't a new thing we came up with. People in this part of the world have been saying it. But it was important to get other world leaders to say, we're talking about Islamist extremism. We're talking about that Khawarij. We have to separate it from the religion because that has to be the discussion. It's that idea you have to pull out. So that ends up in our national security strategy. We're going after an ideology. And also says, just like everyone, since September 11th, we are not at war with Islam. This is not a war against religion. We're honing in on that specific ideology. The Muslim world gets a coalition together. This is funded a lot by Saudi Arabia, but these are 41 nations, bigger now, who said, we can't allow these Khawarij to tarnish our religion. We need to take it back, a reform, if you will, a reformation of some sort. And their top issue was not military, it's ideology. You've got to talk about the issue. You have to understand the issue. You've got to not make it worse by killing people. I'm going to skip that today. We just got a couple seconds. Counterterrorism strategy for the U.S. came out at the end of last year. If you haven't read it, I would dig in there. We are dealing with radical Islamist ideologies for the most part, but there are other different reasons that people commit terrorism. We have to go over that too. It's not just about that. It's about a lot of other drivers. But the real issue, the real solution is probably these women in Morocco, who the king decided should become Islamic scholars. They should go to school and learn the Quran backwards and front, and they should go out to the villages and explain what the Quran actually has in it for messages. Women, because we know durable peace comes from women being involved in these issues. How long have these women been running around in Morocco explaining the Quran to young men? 10 years, 12 years now. They've been doing this. How many women are studying at the Vatican right now to go out and lead churches? This is a big leap. You can amplify projects like this. This is how we make things better, by amplifying good ideas that aren't ours, because you can't make up a good idea and make it work. So I think this is where your money is better spent. Use correct vocabulary. I think this is the easy stuff. But what you said, those are all the right answers. You have to do that. One of those answers we didn't have on there was chase down every terrorist in the world and put a bullet in his forehead. We don't have enough bullets because this is going to keep going on. Terrorism is not going to die as a technique. There will always be another terrorist. But you can get ahead of certain ideologies and try to change it. So I hope that paints a big picture of what's going on in the world, how Islam fits into this, the separation of religion from terrorists who like to misuse religion. And I appreciate that. Listen to my podcast if you want more. And shoot me an email. I'll answer any question. I speak anywhere. So thank you.
Question? Any question for Jason?
Yeah. So maybe not relevant, but I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are, comparisons and contrasts between the Quran and the Bible.
A lot of similarities, especially Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. You're going to see a ton of the same stories over and over again. And I think the forgiveness angle, when you really boil down the Quran and see how many times it says the ultimate thing to do as a human is to forgive, and that God is the most forgiving God, and He is forgiving no matter how stupid you are in life, He's forgiving. I think that really resonates with the New Testament. So lots and lots of overlaps, some big, huge disagreements. Like the role of Jesus, who He is, that's definitely different, but lots of overlap. And most people who are actual real scholars of the Quran will tell you that I had to study the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's written in the Quran. You should study the Torah and the Gospels. So lots of overlap. Yeah.
Do you think the Israeli-Palestine policy still has a big impact on the development of ideology?
It's a great crutch. Does it have a lot of impact these days? Most people don't know what exactly is the rule behind it. They don't know the ins and outs of where the negotiations stand and who's at fault for what. But yeah, it's a great crutch if you have a problem in your country and you want to point to another one and say, get mad, look at what's going on. And, I mean, it's easy to do that. So until Israel and the Palestinian people come to some conclusion, it will always be a driver and an issue. I don't think it's the main one, but it's an easy one to point to. Everybody knows about it. So it's the easy button. Remember that stupid commercial? Yeah.
He touched on it.
Okay. Anything else?
Anyone else?
I'll be around this afternoon if you want to chat. I think we're going hiking and I'll be here today. So.
Pat?
Hey, Jason, thanks so much. Well, Jason has been with us several times, and many times when he's given his presentations at the summer seminar and other places, and we've pretty much given him the inventory of everything that we have for going away presents. But I'm going to give it to you again in case you have that. Well, thanks so much, buddy.
And one drawn left. Take one. You got it? Take it. I'll sign it.
Okay, and just before we go, Mason, you want to come here real quick? You said you. First thing that's good, Mason Hands did a great job the last 3 days for basically rescuing all our IT needs.
So as Mr. Pat mentioned, for the last 3 days, I'm sure everybody has seen me going around various different things. But at the core of things, I'm still a graduate student here at this program. I've been going to class for the last couple of nights as well. The story I want to give is actually from last night when I was leaving campus going back towards my house. If anybody's actually been paying attention on their drive towards the campus here, they might have seen that within 300 yards of our campus is actually the Mexican border and the border fencing. Last night when I was going home along that highway, I looked towards my right and there was about a 50-car train that was actually stopped. And the reason I bring this up is there were 5 white SUVs from the Border Patrol that were there, as well as 1 EPPD officer. And I couldn't say for specifics just because I was driving home, but there was somebody on the ground, and I don't know if he was being arrested or if he was investigating. What I could say is this, and this is specifically for students looking to get in. While you were here at this conference, there was a threat 10 yards from where we are right now. Well, not this specific, but basically from campus. There were threats that you may not even have thought about that, you know, people, especially like me who live here, are dealing with every day. Other thoughts, or other threats that may not have been your first thought or anything like that. So whether it is that you want to get into the IC or law enforcement, there will always be things that need to be addressed, so that people like me and other people across the entire country can always feel safe. Just something to think about.
Thanks so much, Mason. So, we've come to the end of our Professional Development Summit for 2019. Thank you on behalf of the team, knowing Mary wanted us this morning here. We want to thank you very, very much for your participation, for your injection of information, or whatever the case might be. Again, one more thing for the evaluations, please, if you can. Does anyone have any last questions or comments or thoughts? Dr. Valero.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, without any further ado, we ring the bell. We're done. Thank you very much.